Oh my God.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to ArtiFact number 22. Today, I'm joined by Jessica Schneider and Ezekiel Yu. They are both writers and critics. Jessica's a novelist and a poet. Zeke is a cultural critic. They both write for the website that I run, automachination.com. So you could check that out. In fact, you do have to check it out this time around because the subject that we're covering today is Elizabeth Barrett Browning's book-length poem, Aurora Leigh. This was published in 1856, and they actually wrote two essays on it, right? Jessica wrote one, Zeke wrote one. So as soon as you're listening to this, if you're on audio, if you're listening to this on video, it's available on the website right now. So you guys could check that out immediately, or you could do it after the fact, whatever you want. So let's just, I guess, start with Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who she was, what she did. I've often just, I for a long time, I've been very interested in this book because it touches on a number of topics that are interesting to me. Like, so for example, anybody that follows my work knows that I'm very interested in politics. And I have this kind of, almost this competition, as it were, between my political leanings and my artistic leanings, right? I don't allow the politics to consume the artistic side of me, right? In the sense that I'm never going to support, right, a work of art or say it's a great work of art simply because I agree with its politics. And Elizabeth Barrett Browning in this book, she touches on a lot of these themes, right? This kind of competition between what society wants, perhaps some of the demands on things like, if you want to go into charity, that kind of thing. And also what art demands, right? And in her own life, she actually did have very strong political beliefs. I believe some of the stuff that she wrote about, Italy's unification, there was like some guy that was reading her essays in the 1800s and was like, Browning is just a complete, radical freak. It's unbelievable that someone could write some of this kind of stuff. And yet it didn't really infect, right, her writing, right, in the way that you would normally expect today, right? People that have certain political leanings for their writing to be kind of, malformed, as it were, by their political leanings. So personally, I find that interesting. Maybe we could just sort of go around and see what you guys have taken out of this book and then sort of dive into it.
Okay. Should I go first?
Yeah, whatever.
So this was my first time reading Aurora Leigh. I'd been recommended for many years, and I knew it was a novel in verse, and it's quite an immense achievement. But one of the things that you touched upon, Alex, about her the separation of art from politics or any kind of ism is, she has this line. And I quote that in my review. It's from the first book. She says, good aims not always make good books. So right there, you can have, good political beliefs or a message, but doesn't necessarily mean that the craft is going to be able to carry it through. And she seemed to recognize this. This seems, in that sense, a lot of people speak about how it's the feminism and what made it ahead of its time, but it's really kind of like noticing this maybe makes it more is what makes it ahead of its time. Because nowadays, I mean, it's hard to really say. It's sort of like become fallen by the wayside, I would say, craft. I mean, it's much easier to sort of look at something for the subject matter or the political intent, and then from there define it. Whereas craft is much more nuanced. And she definitely has a great craft to her work, and we'll be discussing that. So this was my first time reading it. Now we have three Americans giving our insight into this very well-known British poet.
Yeah, Zeke and I actually, so this is my third time reading it. And I just casually mentioned this to Zeke, and he mentioned a few months ago he had read the book for the first time. And I asked him, hey, do you want to do an essay and do the show with us at the end of the year? Right. So he recently reread that as well. So, what are your impressions? Either what we have said or anything new that you want to say about this?
Yeah, I had first heard about. Well, I'd known about Elizabeth Barrett Browning for a while because I think any reader or serious reader is familiar with her name, and I knew she was a poet and she did sonnets from the Portuguese. But I wasn't familiar with Aurora Leigh until I think either you or Dan had mentioned it as and recommended it as a quality work. And so because of that, I picked it up and I read it, only having read like some of the sonnets from the Portuguese, and then maybe like in my edition it has some of our other works, and so I skimmed through that before reading the verse novel. And I read it, and I think it's worth the hype. It's a really great book, and everything that you guys mentioned I agree with. And I think in particular you wanted me to talk about some of the religious themes that she deals with, and coming from a religious background, and maybe not just religion. Like I thought that a lot of the dichotomies she tries to reconcile, that she presents and tries to reconcile, like life and art, or like love and art, and religion and art, or a lot of it has to do with art, but because she's a working artist. But yeah, I've never read a verse novel either, so it was kind of an adjustment to have to get used to the actual process of reading it. I've read like long poems before, but this particular genre was kind of new to me. So, but it was still fresh, and like a lot of the metaphors and language was a little difficult for me to first understand, but still really fresh, really eloquent. And yeah, I thought it was excellent.
Yeah, I just want to touch on, this idea of, long poem, novel, and verse. Maybe Milton's Paradise Lost, isn't the same thing in the sense of, it's not really a novel, but, just kind of like to make a comparison, I recently reread the introduction to Milton's Paradise Lost. And so both of these are written in blank verse, right? And his introductory stanza is just so forgettable. I literally don't even remember a single line from it now. And all of us, like as you guys were working on this essay, and as I was doing my notes, we, all three of us decided to highlight the introductory stanza in Aurora Leigh, because I mean it's just so rich, right? It's a sort of thing where I'm not sure if you guys feel the same way, but when you start reading like a great Wallace Stevens poem, especially some of his like blank verse poems, although I guess it's not strictly blank verse, you sort of could tell, sometimes from the first stanza, like Sunday Morning, for example, that it's going to be a great poem. And I felt the same way about this introductory stanza in Aurora Leigh. So this is how she starts the book. Of writing many books, there is no end. And I, who have written much in prose and verse for others' uses, will write now for mine, will write my story for my better self, as when you paint your portrait for a friend who keeps it in a drawer and looks at it long after he has ceased to love you, just to hold together what he was and is. And I mean, don't take my word for it. Just anybody listening to this now, just pull up Milton's Paradise Lost, read the introductory stanza, and tell me why, Milton is kind of like this household name for a lot of people, whereas Aurora Leigh at this point is, more or less unknown, right? Just out of curiosity, I did a quote Google search for the term Aurora Leigh, and there's only like 250,000 hits. Right, across the entire internet, someone has only used that phrase about that many times, right? Which is just incredible to me. And maybe we could also dissect the stanza a little bit and talk about why, why. So, Jessica, why did you highlight this as one of your passages to talk about?
Well, let's see that. Yeah, like you said, the introduction, it's very, very strong, because we get this idea. It's a story, but then it's a story within a story. So you have Barrett Browning, and then you have Aurora Leigh as the stand-in for Barrett Browning in the novel. So in some ways, even though it's a fiction, we're not going to say it's autobiography, but it's got some autobiographical elements to her. And she, right there, the fact that it opens with, it's about art first. It's not about romance. It's not about, I'm the woman or this or that. It's about the artist, and all that is superfluous, because that's what ultimately matters first. And then she says, write my story for my better self. Creating the idea of creating art, creating something higher, something to represent you. That's a craft driven, something to represent you, a higher form of yourself. And you paint your portrait for a friend. So now she obviously, as we go through the book, she wants to become known, and she wants to share it. But this is in the beginning, she's sort of questioning that. But anyway, as the first book is quite strong. I mean, it's just a really great beginning. And then going back to about what I said, good aims not always make good books. She speaks about, I read books, bad and good, and she's not afraid to call this out. This is back in, Victorian era, and, women having opinions and things like that. But she, as an artist, isn't afraid to call this out.
Yeah, it's interesting because even in this first line, right, of writing many books, there is no end. When I reread this most recently, so Joel and I last year, we did a show on the biblical book Ecclesiastes, and there's a line in there that is of I think it's of reading many books, there is no end. I forget exactly if that's the line, but here we have this transition to this idea of writing, and I mean that's kind of novel in and of itself, right? In the sense that if you want to view this from a feminist lens, right, we are talking about a woman creating something, right? I have written so much for others' uses. Now I'm going to do this for myself. Right. I'm not going to, be a woman serving other people, other people's needs, other people's uses. I need to do what I need to do. And also this kind of odd tension, near the end where it's kind of, it's a little bit self-deprecating, right? People have perhaps ceased to love me, or maybe I'm not, constantly throughout the text, Aurora Leigh is trying to write this masterwork. And, interestingly enough, we don't ever actually read it, right? We don't get to see it. We have the Aurora Leigh novel written by Browning, but we don't have the manuscript that she's writing, actually the character within the text. All we get is kind of secondhand information where other people are relating and say, hey, this is finally you've done something good, but we're taking other men's words for it, right? And that is also a very kind of interesting dynamic, right? So sorry for talking so much. Zeke, do you want to say anything about the opening?
Yeah, a couple things. I think what I found really cool about the stanza was that how I wrote this in my essay, but how much it seems to compress so much of the book's themes on memory and love and loss of love into just these 8 lines. And also for all the talk about its the feminism of the book, apart from the title, you wouldn't know necessarily the gender of the speaker from this opening. It's just someone who writes books. This is this is telling the story of a writer who's attempting to do something great. And for the biblical reference for the Ecclesiastes, I remember, and we can talk about this later, but I remember Alex, you making a note about there's a kind of deist lens or a deist approach in terms of religion, but for me, I think there's so much biblical reference and Christian reference and Christian mythology, and that it seems to me there is a character who seems kind of a deist in the book, but it seems like this is very much a Judeo-Christian and not a deist, or I don't know how to. Yeah, it's not a deist. Yeah.
Anyway. When Joel and I were doing the sonnets from the Portuguese, which is a sonnet sequence that Browning wrote prior to this book, I assumed that she was a deist, but it turns out that she is in fact a Christian. But interestingly, although yes, she does have Christian mythology and also especially a lot of Old Testament material. Phrases like Jesus Christ appear only 2 or 3 times. Right. It's much more so kind of this, like this overall idea of like the Lord, right? But Jews might more or less say the same thing, right? So I agree that it's Christian, but she kind of defaults to kind of the Bible in general, maybe a little bit more of Old Testament and more the mythology rather than direct references to what we would think as of Christian theology and stuff like that. But yes, that's also true.
And I think at one point, I think Romney even, I referenced this, I believe I referenced this in my essay. Romney makes a reference to the fact that Christ had to be a man or something like that. Yeah, if I
can't produce a Christ,
yeah.
And so Jessica mentioned that the first book is very strong. First book is probably, so there's 9 books, right, in this text. First book is probably my favorite overall, because I mean they're about 1,200 lines each book. The last one is about like 950 or so. But she compresses so much in these 1,200 lines, right? We have this, great opening stanza. We have her history as a child. We have the fact that her mother dies when she's an adolescent, and the way that that affects her psychologically and how that works upon her memory. We have her kind of like intellectual upbringing afterwards. We have her father's death. We have her being sort of sent off to her aunt and the kind of conflicts that this creates, and how she, essentially becomes also, a Jane Eyre type of misfit, right? She wants to read books. She wants to do art. She doesn't exactly know she doesn't know exactly where she's going to fit into that kind of world, but she knows she wants to be part of the art world, and we get all of that in just 1,200 lines. So just even in terms of like the pure economy of narrative, right? This is one of the strongest books in the text. I'm not sure if you guys have anything you want to say about the first book. I got passages later that we could get to.
Yeah. Well, it sets it up too. Like you said, the first book is about right from the beginning, she's an outcast. She doesn't feel she belongs. She's born in Italy. She's sent to England, and the descriptions about England are quite amusing. That she basically she thinks it's, I think, too genteel or doesn't have all the hills, and that there's a missing romance to it. And so she has this dark hair, and I think she compares it to like birds, having birds in it. And I know there's another, when I mentioned a story within a story within a story, Marion, the other character that we see later, is based on Barrett Browning's likeness as well. So you have multiple ways of where you have these sort of outcasts, and right from the beginning, she doesn't really fit in. She doesn't really connect very well with her father's sister. She's lost her mother, so she feels alone, and she has to seek inward for some kind of comfort. And she looks to art, which is a lot of what artistic people do. In that sense, she has very much the artistic personality as we would know today.
Zeke?
The romantic.
Right. Like pretty much like a little bit of book 2 as well, but like pretty much everything you need to know about Aurora, like at her fundamental level, is dealt with in book 1. Like, because books 1 through 4 are kind of her artistic maturation, and she's sort of writing like from a distance, and it's very retrospective. That's why there's kind of this mood that's very nostalgic. That's not so much present in the later books, like after book 5. And I agree about book 1. And I used to think that I thought book 5 was actually the best, because to me there was something about it being right in the middle, and there's so much philosophizing. But a lot of really important character work happens in book 1. And like I said, like everything you need to know about Aurora is told to you, and like her thoughts on womanhood and her relationship to men, and her views on art. But it's really like the individualism that her father instilled in her that informs her thoughts on art. That's all in book 1, and again, like in 1,200 lines, and in beautiful language.
Well, you make a good point about the 5th book. Yes, the 5th book does a lot of philosophy and about art. And there's probably the most talk about what art is, what longing is, the longing to prove oneself.
Yes.
Is a lot of very much establishing kind of her identity in this this is who I am. And the book does, I mean, she does throughout the poem. You do have elements where she's addressing the fact that I wrote this poem, it wasn't very good, and she admits that, but I don't believe we ever see any examples of it. But she's acknowledging that. She's like, oh, I'm just not quite getting it. It's not quite there. So she has this realization, and it makes me wonder, like, these other, writers who are not as are inferior writers, do they have this question? Do you sit there and write this and you really think you hit the gold mine every single time? Or do you sit there knowing, oh, it's just missing something? And she did.
Right.
In book one, there's this interesting passage starting at line 174, where basically, she's going on about this painting done of her mother, right? And growing up without a mother, she's kind of like, in a sense, controlled by this painting. Everything that she learns, everything that she sees, feels, detects, she starts mixing up, right, with this image of her mother. Right. She says, like, everything that was like ghastly or grotesque or beautiful, right? Everything sort of came into this picture for her. And this is the way that this gets characterized. And while I stared away my childish wits upon my mother's picture, poor child, my father, who through love had suddenly thrown off the old conventions, broken loose from chin bands of the soul like Lazarus, yet had no time to learn to talk and walk or grow anew familiar with the sun, who had reached to freedom, not to action, but lived as one entranced, with thoughts, not aims, whom love had unmade from a common man, but not completed to an uncommon man. My father taught me what he had learned the best before he died and left me, grief and love. And seeing we had books among the hills, strong words of counseling souls confederate with vocal pines and waters, out of books he taught me all the ignorance of men. Right, that's such a beautiful, idea. Out of books, he taught me all the ignorance of men, and how God laughs in heaven when any man says, "Here I'm learned, this I understand, and that I am never caught at fault or doubt." He sent the schools to school, demonstrating a fool will pass for such through one mistake. Well, a philosopher will pass for such through said mistakes being ventured into gross and heaped up to a system. I am like, they tell me, my dear father, broader brows, howbeit upon a slenderer undergrowth of delicate features, paler, near as grave. But then my mother's smile breaks up the whole and makes it better sometimes than itself. And it's so wonderful because, prior to this, she's talking about her mother. Now she's talking about her father. And just when you think that she has forgotten, what the passage was like really about, her mother's image comes back in. And in the most kind of like, how can you compliment your mother in the most maximal way? And the way that she says is, my mother's smile breaks up the whole and makes it better sometimes than itself, right? Everything being combined that way. I've always thought that was a very wonderful part of the book.
Yeah, she definitely kind of idealizes her parents very much, like those examples you give. But then, like, it's interesting when you have her when she meets her father's sister, and she basically talks about her aunt's loaded questions about making her ordinary. She compares her. She says, I know I have not ground you down enough to flatten and bake you to a wholesome crust. She again, this is all interpreted through Aurora's lens, but she doesn't feel that connection with her aunt. It causes her that separation. And so it's almost, the mother is sort of in the background. She's this, wonderful, someone she looks to for comfort. And then again, her father showed her these books. And there's just, as you were just reading it, I mean, really, it's really not hard to follow. I mean, it's really rather easy to understand, especially once you get the sense of the story, because this isn't a particularly complex story in the sense of narrative plot. I mean, it's a lot of similar tropes that we've seen, but the difference is how she says it, the way she uses words. That's what differentiates, writing or poetry or any art is the how.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, she definitely, I mean, that's sort of her issue. It's this like sort of obsession with the ideal that haunts her and really plagues her and really affects her relationships with Romney and Marion, especially when she meets Marion again. But also I found it interesting, like I was reading, there's this really nice Victorian literature resource that I was scouring through yesterday, sort of last minute. And there was talk about the text being a feminist text. And in the book one, I think it's mentioned that she feels like a mother want about the world. She was raised by a single father, and there really wasn't any woman around her aside from her maid, Assunta. And she even says something like I was born to make my father sadder. And throughout the text, her relationship with other women is complicated, perhaps because of this childhood and how she's this complicated relationship with even just her image of her mother. And I think people would call it now, I think that the contemporary term is like internalized misogyny. And how she has this sort of disgust at her own sex. And that's another dichotomy that I think she deals with. And it's born in book one.
Yeah,
and there's so much. I'm sorry, just so much goes on the inside. Like that's the other thing. It's like this is really a book about the inside. Yeah. What's going on the outside is this. It's not that convoluted, but on the inside, there's so much complexity. So that's what separates it there.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry, Alex.
I mean, in terms of these feminist readings, right? I think one of the reasons why the book has sort of fallen out of favor is this was in many senses like revolutionary in the 1800s, and perhaps in many ways it still is. But there's this kind of a argument, as Zeke sort of alluded to, that women, if you're a woman, even in the 1800s, women are not necessarily your natural allies, and especially they're not your natural allies if you are, kind of, a misfit, if you're interested in the arts, if you have like a richer internal life. Right. And, she has, that's not to say that men are necessarily naturally her allies either, because they're not. Right. She, from the very beginning, like book one introduces Romney. And so Romney becomes, her, he's not her love interest at first. They do eventually, it seems they get married. But at the beginning, she's very kind of resistant to this idea. Right. He asks to marry her. She says no. And their first kind of interaction in book one is basically he's like taking on this like fatherly chiding tone around like
very
line
condescending.
Yeah.
Very condescending. And I mentioned that a lot in my review because I'm reading this and it's like, why would she want to be with you? You're such a sexist dickhead. I mean, he really is annoying in the beginning. It's not she grows to love him because he eventually sort of morphs himself. He tries to be better. I think he sees her. He's like, I want to be a better man kind of thing. But in the beginning, he's just annoying twit. He's her cousin. And it's just like, she doesn't want you. Move on.
and just compare that dynamic to something like Jane Eyre, right? Where, Jane Eyre from the very beginning, like she starts to fall in love with Rochester, who is like, he's such a creep, right? And he keeps like manipulating people, and he behaves in like very odd ways. And like, what exactly, is your interest based on? It seems like it's nothing more other than, he's weird. He's rich and powerful, like in this setting. Right. And older. Right. And that struck me as a lot more kind of, anti-feminist, although ironically, when I, think of like professors that I had or, people that I knew, they always like talk about like growing up reading Jane Eyre and like really like, sort of seeing themselves in Jane, seeing themselves in this kind of dynamic. Whereas Aurora Leigh is much more, it's much more rebellious from the very beginning, right? Even before we get any kind of expression that Romney is interested in her romantically, their first interaction essentially is she's kind of like, she overhears someone saying that she might die because, oh, look, she's this Italian child that's sickly in England, and her face kind of lights up because she hates her life. And Romney's like very upset, like, really, you want to die, right? And
he's such a buffoon. He doesn't understand. It's like I sit there and go, he doesn't understand women. He doesn't understand artistic women. He doesn't understand poetry, but he thinks he does. And you just you're reading it. You want him to shut up. But going back briefly, what you said about Jane Eyre, I remember there's this great line in there. I don't remember where Rochester, he's another egomaniac, and he asks Jane, he says, "Do you find me handsome?" And she goes, "No, sir."
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I thought that was great.
Yeah. And just one of the reasons why I'm bringing up Jane Eyre is, just in terms of comparing the two on a line by line basis, a book like Jane Eyre has nothing on Aurora Leigh, right? There's few lines, there's some quotable lines, there's some, I guess, parts that are pretty good, but, like just going line by line, a book like this is far richer, beyond being, beyond the kind of like, meta issues of like feminism and all this macro stuff that people prefer to talk about, just craft wise. Line by line, you get a lot more on top of, something that a modern person ought to, you ought to get more out of Aurora Leigh, right? I think now than something like Jane Eyre, right? Where Jane Eyre is much more dated and of its time. Aurora Leigh is still so very modern when you read it.
Just a word about Romney. I think, he does not come off well in book one or any of the other books. But I think, his very first words, I find that there's this sort of, it's kind of telling where he says, like what you were saying, Alex. She says, she'll die. And then my cousin Romney Leigh blushed too with sudden anger and approaching me, said low between his teeth, "You're wicked now? You wish to die and leave the world at dusk for others with your naughty light blown out?" The naughty light, there's something there, like he's, I think he's attracted to it still. He's angered, but there's something about her that he's drawn to. And of course, they're both drawn to each other, but they hate each other.
She at one point says, you basically looking for a wife is like a horse.
A horse,
is no different than a horse.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if a man is liberal, he might leave out some hay, right? That was how that's how the phrase ends.
Right.
Yeah. And the joke being on the fact that, like Romney, right? He's this kind of, he wants to be very charitable, right? He wants to be a philanthropist. He wants to like essentially save the world. But to her, like a liberal man, like in that kind of, marital dynamic, to you, like he's out saving the world, and to you, after treating you like a horse, he will leave out some hay, and that's his liberalism. And it's interesting because like you would have like the same kind of modern critiques that we would have of like, contemporary liberalism. She's making those same critiques, right? It's not, it's not the same exact political strain, but it's very, very similar,
well, it's
right?
like, it's the whole guilty white liberal thing.
Exactly.
It's like, oh, the limousine liberal. Oh, poor them. But they don't want to really get their hands dirty. I'll leave some hay out for you or something.
Yeah.
And it's like that always kind of that always annoyed me, because I always felt like people who do that are just really trying to show off what a good person they are, because it's like, well, do you really care, or are you just doing this for a facade?
Yeah, it says like in that passage introducing him, as early master of Leigh Hall, whereof the nightmare sat upon his youth, repressing all its seasonable delights and agonizing with a ghastly sense of universal hideous want and wrong to incriminate possession. So he has everything, right? But he feels guilty about it because he sees everyone else sort of like, oh, everyone else is so wanting of what I have. And there's that self-loathing that operates there.
Well, and then his whole, like, later when we see him wanting to marry Marion, and it's almost like he's doing it out of charity.
Exactly.
It's like, oh, you're poor, I'll marry you. And it's just, he's got his whole, he's just a mess. Romney is just like, you're like, come on. And
he's also the very thing that her father would hate, a man of systems.
Yes. Exactly.
So book one ends with her kind of, falling into the arts, right? She's reading, and there's this like great description of like, she's sort of like leaving the house, and she feels like people are hunting her, right? And they're hunting her not necessarily by like trying to do bad things to her, but they're trying to keep her away from this internal life that she's like slowly cultivating. And there's also this other like interesting dynamic, like even in terms of like the wider kind of like plot, right? A lot of it reminded me of a movie that Jessica reviewed for automaticnation.com, El Sur, right? Where we have this like idea of like the south of Spain being this, place of like mystery, right? For the little girl, right? She hears these stories from her father and she's always attracted to it. And Britain has the same kind of, idea for her. But the irony is like when she gets into Britain, she's like, really, this is Britain. It's, it's so stormy. It's so dark. It's so like unaccommodating. It's
flat.
so, flat. Right. So we have this kind of like, El Sur thing going on in reverse. Right. But this is her father's land, right? She characterizes this originally, this is my father's land.
And it's interesting about the English. She's saying hearing other people speak her father's tongue. Yeah. It was a strange experience for her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. I thought that was interesting.
And about the landscape, like she describes it like there's like not a garden that isn't hedged in, or like the natural world is constrained, and very much the same way I think she critiqued the society of it being constrained by all these mores and rules that restrict individual freedom and passion, and the landscape mirrors that.
Mm-hmm.
Almost.
Yep.
So getting into book 2, it starts with her already now 20 years old, right? So she's looking back as a 27-year-old, and she's looking back at being 20. And Jessica correctly pointed out that, Romney, he's annoying. He clearly has many flaws from the very beginning. But Aurora Leigh also has quite a few flaws that, Jane Eyre doesn't really have flaws. Like you just sort of see her at the beginning, like being, like beat up and, being made fun of and being hurt, kind of like cruel and without any reason whatsoever. Whereas Aurora Leigh has this, she wants to be a poet. And as a 20-year-old who's already started writing at that point, she's sort of like going around the garden and she's trying to like find some kind of flowers or something to crown herself with, right? Mm-hmm. And the way that she that talks about it is, so she's like, all right, how can I crown myself? Like, it's going to be in sport, not pride. To learn the feel of it before my brows be numb as Dante's own to all the tender pricking of such leaves, right? And when she's thinking of what leaves she could use to make this crown for herself, she decides to like reject the bay leaves, right? She doesn't want to be crowned a laurel. And, like it's interesting because like Browning herself, right? She was educated on, Greek and Roman classics. If you were to read like a Greek or Roman text, making a laurel sort of crown for yourself would be considered hubris, right? This would take, this sort of, like the vengeance of the gods if you do something like that. So she's like, you know what? I'm not going to use bay leaves. I'm going to, I think she settles on ivy, right? But still, it's like this kind of like, a funny little image where she's sort of going around the garden. She wants to be a poet. We don't have any evidence of her really writing anything or doing anything worthwhile just yet, but she still wants to know what it feels like. And ultimately, she's discovered by Romney, and she turns red. She's blushing, and this is the opportunity that he uses to, after like essentially calling her silly. This is the opportunity that he uses to then propose marriage, right?
Yeah.
Right.
It's like you just insulted her and now you're going to like, I mean, it's ridiculous.
Yeah. There's a lot of like subtle comedy going on that, like if you like, cause it's a poem, you might not really get right away, but just structurally, when you think about how things are, put together, right. There's a lot of like, implied humor throughout.
See, I made my note. I wrote here, dick, cause it's showing him being a dick. And I'm like, I'm just going to, and what he says, you write well and ill upon the whole as other women. You write just as well or as poorly as a woman would. Yeah. And it's just like, he just continues to like, he's doing this sort of patronizing backhanded compliment thing. And, it's just like, get out of here.
Yeah. His idea of sweet talking. I will say about like with the laurels and crowning herself, And we'll probably talk about it more, but like, I think that's another one of the reasons why I chafe against the deist interpretation, because not only is there so many Judeo-Christian references, and also the trope of the Redeemer shows up constantly, but also like there's an almost pagan adoration of like the natural world, and constant references to classical mythology. That's why. But anyway,
I found that passage I mentioned in the second book about Christ. Romney again is pontificating. Uncomprehended by you, must remain unflinched by you. Women as you are, mere women, personal and passionate, you give us doting mothers and perfect wives, sublime Madonnas and enduring saints. We get no Christ from you, and verily we shall not get a poet in my mind. So he's ranking, Christ and poetry up there with Christ. I mean, because poetry back then was highly respected. But even though you still, as we see, she struggles to make money. She has to write like cheesy kind of copy to pay the bills. And it was interesting. I just watched, Alex, a film I just watched that I'm going to review was Jane Campion's Bright Star on Keats. And Keats, it's about his love interest with Fanny Howe, and Fanny Brom rather. Right. Where did I get that name? Anyway, Keats, they didn't like that he always felt bad that he didn't have a means to make a living. So even though he was a poet and respected, it's like, don't you want to go into medicine instead? And it's still the same kind of pressures back then. So it's just interesting to see that. Yeah.
And also, woman can't produce a Christ. There's also the Moses and Miriam thing that he plays with. Like, you can't get a Moses out. Basically, like, women can be good poets, but we all know that the best is produced in men. And so why even try? Leave those who are capable of the highest accomplishment.
And already she's got so much to fight against. He puts so much ahead of her to fight against. And so a lot of her reactions, if you wonder if he was just more supportive, if people were just more supportive, maybe she wouldn't feel the need to constantly fight back in her own internal dialogue. It's more of a defensive stance that she's taking, because others are coming at her. Well, you can't do this and you can't do that. And, you're just like, oh, screw you.
Yeah. And interestingly, she kind of internalizes a lot of that criticism later, when she kind of says some demeaning things about the fairer sex, so to speak, that she's at war with herself. Like, she wants to be an artist, but to do that, she has to sacrifice being a woman. And that dichotomy is also something I found a little problematic, but it's there. And I found it interesting. So.
Well, to the extent that, we have like flawed characters within the book, and Aurora Leigh is one of these flawed characters, right? She's not perfect by any means. It is true that like here, she's obviously going to be, very reactive to not only society, but specifically to like what Romney's telling her. But she, to be, like great at her craft, like it does seem like she learns slowly to be less reactive, less caring, less accommodating. Again, the opening stanza of the entire book, right? I will now write for my uses, right? It takes time for her to get to that stage, right? It's not merely, that she rejects Romney for being an asshole, although he is. It's also that she has to grow up as well. And we and again, it is interesting that we don't ever see that manuscript. And also, like there is, speaking to that, like kind of like pagan and Christian tension, this, the idea that women, ought not or cannot write, that does strike me as, something that's much more Victorian than it is Roman or Greek. I mean, when it comes, a lot of like Roman poets, for example, they really put, like poets like Sappho like on a pedestal, right? To the extent that like we could find like fragments of Sappho, it seems like not very good poetry to me, but I mean, who knows what the wider work was. So that wasn't necessarily the impression, back then, but kind of you go into the modern day and you get this kind of like Victorian strain, and she is like, picking a lot from, like non-Christian mythology to make some of the cases that she's making. Right. Sure. And, like maybe we'll get to Virginia Woolf later, right, who reviewed the book. Right. And, obviously like Virginia Woolf, I think to all three of us is pretty annoying, but what really got me is like when she was doing her review of Aurora Leigh, she was like, this is like, like a pallid woman that's like kind of, like no spirit, no verve, no life, no experience. And also she was like knocking her like Elizabeth Barrett Browning's education, which is just insane to me. Like I feel like, based on what I know about her education, she knew a lot about, Greek and Roman classics in the original languages. Yeah. Right. And it's irrelevant that she didn't have the same level of expertise as some of the classicists, from the time period did, because she clearly extracted a lot more actual value that you could build upon from these works than the classicists who, simply treated them as, essentially dead tomes that they couldn't do anything with other than, analyze in pure like linguistic fashion, as opposed to, make something worthwhile with it.
Yeah. And like when she was 11, I think she wrote like the Battle of Marathon, which is her own Homeric epic. But she was 11 years old, and she had like a blind Greek tutor, I think, which is cool. And I think it's telling that, at 11, she sort of dispenses with just pure imitation. And this book is, I think, because she is aspiring to this new kind of epic, which the verse novel is supposed to accomplish. And it isn't this sort of just, inert imitation of bygone poets. It's her own spin. It's her own a take on culminating, everything she's learned and all of history of the arts and all that, merging it into the present day and present circumstances. And it's and people did not like that, or they thought it was not just Virginia Woolf, but like critics of her day. I put a review clipping from a contemporary reviewer, and it was is about as condescending as you can imagine from a sort of boorish male critic at the time. But
oh no.
And what's interesting to me though is that Browning does not, and also Aurora Leigh, they do not reject the idea of women's writing as apart from men's writing. It's not even so much that they want to do what men do. Part of it is also like, well, we could do things that are just as good, but differently, right? So like, like Browning, she did write, that like kind of, Homeric style epic early on, right? When she was very young. And you see like in some of her letters and some of the other stuff that she might've said that she rejected a lot of that. She was like, I was doing something that wasn't me, but what turns out to be me is something that an 1800s woman would do, which is not write Homeric style epics. It's not let's do what men do. Let's do in a manly, masculine way. Like some of the reviews, said stuff like it would be ridiculous to have a woman write like a Homeric epic. I mean, maybe or maybe not, but to me, it would just be kind of, it would be a little weird. And this is so much preferable. I mean, first of all, right, like you have to deal with what's available to you. And I forget what book it is. We'll get to it later, but there's this passage that she has, something like, I don't trust writers and critics that cannot extract anything of value from the present age. If they cannot engage with the present age, if they cannot deal with the present age, if they cannot build something out of the present age, I cannot trust them to, say something worthwhile about the past or about the future. Right. So, that's another interesting detail. Like it is feminist, but not in a way that, contemporary readers might necessarily view the word. Because I feel like a lot of contemporary readers might view feminism as nothing more than, let's turn men into women and women into men, right? Which is not what she's arguing. And that's not necessarily the route to value, right?
Well, like I said, it's a lot of defensive stance. It's a lot of defensiveness. That's where it stems, because she's constantly having, you can't do this, and this opposition,
Yeah. And Aurora, she's also, not just the sexism, which is clear, but there's this pessimism of the age that Romney epitomizes. Like in book 2, he says, the civilizer's spade grinds horribly on dead men's bones and cannot turn up soil that's otherwise unfetid. All success, this is on page, on my edition, page 40, lines 265. The civilizer's spade grinds horribly, second book, on dead men's bones and cannot turn up soil that's otherwise unfetid. All success proves partial failure. All advance implies what's left behind. All triumph, something crushed at the chariot wheels. All government, some wrong. And rich men make the poor, who curse the rich, who agonize together, rich and poor, under and over in the social spasm and crisis of the ages. So it's not a rosy picture. And Aurora replies with, and I guess there's still some of that still favoring men somewhat, but she says in page 46 of my edition, 477, lines 475 rather, I hold you will not compass your poor ends of barley feeding and material ease without a poet's individualism to work your universal. It takes a soul to move a body. It takes a high-souled man to move the masses, even to a cleaner sty. It takes the ideal to blow a hair's breadth off the dust of the actual. Ah, your furriers failed, because not poets enough to understand that life develops from within. And there's more of that idealism, or the spiritual versus the material, and the earthly versus the divine. That's caught up in her response as well. But yeah, I mean, like it's that the cynicism of the age, the grimy, urban, industrial, materialistic 19th century England that she, in a kind of romantic opposition, she fights against.
Yeah. And she, she still is, as she's fighting in her defensive stance, she still is somewhat deferring at the same time because to men, because that's the pressures. But it's like, so it's kind of like this back and forth. And I've noticed too, throughout the book, there's this guilt kind of she feels like guilty at wanting this attention, at wanting the recognition that men have, that somehow, I want this, but am I bad? Questioning herself. Is this worth it? Or am I bad to want this?
And right after she says, I should have read on. For me, perhaps I am not worthy, as you say, of work.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah. Perhaps a woman's soul aspires and not creates. Yet we aspire. And yet I'll try out your perhapses, sir. And if I fail, why burn me up my straw like other false works? So she's up for the challenge.
There's so many angles you can go with this text because it is so rich. It encompasses so many rich internal feelings that to me, just to limit it to just mere like feminism just seems like kind of to make it really simplistic, because this is really about an artist's struggle to find herself and her voice and her talent and her make her way in the world. Yes, it does have the traditional ending where she ends up with the guy, but at least he does show some improvement and you're like, all right, I guess.
Yeah.
That's how I was.
So book 2, right? All of this, it comes in the heels of, Romney asking to marry her. She says no. Yeah. And ultimately, so her aunt, right, that she's living with, she hears about the fact that Aurora Leigh rejects Romney. And there's this passage around a line like shortly before line 700 in book 2 that struck me as like, it's kind of like ahead of its time, because we hear, a lot of women say the same thing now, like, don't fucking tell me how I feel or what I'm thinking, I could speak for myself, right? Men do often want to, be like, well, I know what you're thinking, and it's X, Y, it's X, Y, and Z.
Mansplaining.
Well,
that's another thing he does. That's what Romney does, mansplain.
But not even like mansplaining in the generic sense of like the way that it's used today is like, some woman on Twitter says some dumb fucking thing. Some guy's like, well, actually, I was like, oh no, don't do that. Don't correct me. Don't mansplain. Right. But here you have, the example here is much more one of like cutting into like, emotionally who you are. Right. So, after basically being, rejecting him and being confronted by her aunt, Aurora Leigh writes, I blushed. I feel the brand upon my forehead now strike hot, sear deep, as guiltless men may feel the felon's iron, say and scorn the mark of what they are not. Most illogical, irrational nature of our womanhood that blushes one way, feels another way, and prays perhaps another. After all, we cannot be the equal of the male who rules his blood a little. For although I blushed indeed as if I loved the man, and her incisive smile, accrediting that treason a false witness in my blush, did bow me downward like a swath of grass below its level that struck me. Right. And, you know, this is also like, I can't think of any other kind of, you know, passage from this period or even before the 1800s that gets into this kind of dynamic of, you know, a woman sort of like, you know, betraying her feelings, but in a way where it's not actually her feelings. This is just like what you want to imbue into her thoughts, right, into her emotions, just for, you know, whatever you want to get out of it, right? In this case, it's, oh, you have to marry him and, you know, sort of, you know, continue the family line in the way that's prescribed, right? And I mean, you know, like in little ways, like, you know, you see this all the time, like, you know, like woman who goes down the street, like, and, you know, she's not like smiling on some guy hitting on her. And the guy's like, smile a little, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And I mean, one time when I walked down the fucking street, I'm not smiling at anybody. One time, some guy, he was like trying to hand me like some flyer or like some shit. And I just like walked past him and he was like, smile. And I was so fucking angry. I was like, imagine like hearing this 5 times a day.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, very much ahead of its time. Even these like little ways that, you know, like you could read this and like completely forget about this like little, you know, passage, but I mean, it's a lot, right? And it gets into, you know, the cores of, you know, being a woman in that time period, in a way that seems like a little bit throwaway, but it's not, right? It's a lot more important than it seems. So,
and she's able to pick that apart. And so,
yeah. Well, book 2 ends, I believe, with her decision to go to London, right? So she decides to go to London to be a writer, and book 3 opens up already with I guess a little bit of success, right? I don't know exactly how old she is, but she's older than 20, younger.
27, I think.
27. Yeah.
She's already 27 here. Okay. So, she's made some headway as a writer, right? She's constantly getting like fan mail, right? Editors are asking her for this or that, right? Opinions on various things. So, you know, essentially she's kind of like a mini celebrity, right? In that world, but she's not happy with her work. And this is the other interesting part about all this. I feel like a lot of like more typically feminist style books from this time period or later would be like, and now she has found fame and everything that she's ever wanted, she has. And isn't that so wonderful? She has finally proven herself, but really she knows better. She knows that although, yes, as a woman, she's found fame and she's making some money, that's not enough. She wants something more than that. She wants to be great at the craft. She wants to be a great poet. And so far, all that she has to show for it are, you know, essentially youthful verses, right? As she characterizes them. Again,
mere tones. She says mere tones and organized to any tune. Yeah. And I think she gets, she rips. Oh yeah. Here she talks about, I rip my verses up and found no blood upon the rapier's point. So basically that there's no life to them is what she's saying.
Yeah. I mean,
which again speaks of that self-awareness. I mean, like for many people, I sit and wondered, like you get these kind of writers and they get a little bit of notoriety. And then is that enough for them? And they're just like, hey, there you go. And it's all about the image, but she wants something more than that. She's like, but no, I want to, have something that lasts, that's long lasting.
Yeah. And she is self-aware and objective. Even in lines 204 to like 207, she says, I worked with patience, which means almost power. I did some excellent things indifferently, some bad things excellently. Both were praised, the latter loudest. And I don't think, it's hard to be aware of the quality of your own work. But maybe she's wrong, but it's telling that she can be so objective about it. And plus, some of the passages here are just incredibly beautiful. Like when she's I'll read a bit of it in lines 169. So happy and unafraid of solitude, I worked the short days out and watched the sun on lurid morns or monstrous afternoons like some druidic idol's fiery brass, with fixed, unflickering outline of dead heat, in which the blood of wretches pent inside seemed oozing forth to incarnadine the air, push out through fog with his dilated disk, and startle the slant roofs and chimney pots with splashes of fierce color. Or I saw fog only, the great tawny weltering fog, involve the passive city, strangle it alive and draw it off into the void, spires, bridges, streets, and squares, as if a sponge had wiped out London.
Mm.
And just wonderful. And
Yeah, a lot of
idol, more pagan.
Yeah. I think probably that's one of the reasons why Jessica and I and others have identified with this book in some way, because I mean it's not I often see writers, or I've known people like in my personal life that they admit to being like mediocre writers. Yes. Or mediocre critics, and yet they continue to do it simply because it's like, well, I could get my name out there. And not only do I hate that, it's like when you read a book like Aurora Leigh and people are identifying with the wrong message, right? They're identifying with the success of the outward success, and they don't see what it's really about. It's the internal struggle. It's the idea of, I want to make something valuable and worthwhile on my own terms, not simply as let me get the same fame as a man, right, or whatever else. Yeah. That's not what it's about, right? So this is definitely a book for a certain kind of misfit, right?
Yes.
So.
The real artist, I suppose, rather than just the imitation of one.
Yeah, sure.
Because a lot of times people are okay with just being the imitation because they figure, well, they don't know the difference anyway. So I can just look the part and play the part, and that makes me the part, but it really doesn't.
Yes. And she knows she's doing sort of like, she's making like encyclopedias, writing for magazines, and sort of trivia. And she's not like convinced that she's doing some great work just yet. Whereas I feel other artists might feel self-important, which everything they write is like, oh, this is going to change the world or something. I don't know.
And book 3 is also interesting because, although she's found this kind of success, and you would think that, oh, I have shown Romney up, right? I did what he said that I couldn't do in some ways, I guess. And yet, kind of like, pretty much every book, right? Every single book, whether it's book 1, even if that's kind of like the first like superficial interactions that they have, to book 3, where she's far away from him, right? She's in London. She's kind of like doing her own thing. But she's still like mentioning him, right? She's still clearly thinking about him in every single book, right? There is a mention of Romney, right? So like, if you're reading for the first time, you don't know that they're going to end up married, but upon rereading it, it is an interesting kind of like psychological observation to make, that, right, that she is, routinely having this guy in her mind, and it's not all necessarily negative, right? There's that kind of reactive element, but there's still this kind of, she's still a little bit drawn to him, whether it's because like he does seem to be like a good person in many ways, right? He is trying to do something good for the world. In the same way that she is, although in a very different way. He's in her thoughts. And in book 3, this is kind of like a little bit of a device in the sense that after she starts thinking about him, she's visited by this character, right? This villain, right? The closest thing I guess you get to a villain in the book, Lady Waldemar, who basically she wants to, she's upper class. She wants to marry Romney, but she also knows that Romney is interested in Aurora. And also she hears about this other, love interest of Romney, right? Marion, right? This poor girl that he sort of, takes for himself and decides that, this is the one that I'm going to marry. She's essentially one of his charity cases that he visits, and he falls in love with her. Does anybody want to say about anything about the visit or about Lady Waldemar in general?
Well, yeah, Waldemar, she's just a manipulator. Yeah. She's just sort of spinning it, and how much I wonder with regard to Aurora and her thinking of Romney is really deep down still going back to kind of craving his validation a little bit, probably wanting to prove herself to prove, win his validation. And it could be in the back of her mind. And then, yes, we see Marion. Marion is basically based on Barrett Browning herself. So it's like a character within the character within the, within the book is just she's poor. She's had a hard life. She's struggled. And, Romney wants to marry her. This is, out of, I think, pity. It's not a reason to marry anybody, but it's never actually said in the beginning, but she figures this out. Marion figures this out and she stands him up. She's like, no, hell no. And you're like, good for her. Because he, pretty much she realizes, I think she actually makes the horse quote about wanting a wife is no different than a horse. And it's like, wow, Romney, you don't know. So Lady Waldemar, she kind of just comes in and she manipulates things and she spins it and, she sees what she can, she's just trying to triangulating people and Aurora doesn't like her. She sees her as pretentious and phony and she doesn't like her, and for good reason.
Yeah. And it's interesting. So like, even as the book starts, right, she is sort of like reacting, it seems like to Romney's comments, right, where she feels like, all right, maybe Romney was kind of right in the sense that, I can't be a poet, right, because I'm a woman. She starts taking to heart what he says, but for the wrong reasons, right? Her issue is not that she's a woman. Her issue is the inexperience. In the same way that Romney, right? Okay, so what is his flaw? His flaw is he starts conflating his pity for people with genuine love and affection. And he starts conflating pity with like some kind of, equality, right? Marriage like entails like some level of equality. And, he's just assuming that, as long as I have the pity part down, I could have the marriage, right? I could have the love, right? So both of them in their different ways are making these, dual conflations, right? Early on, right? She's thinking, what if they're right? And Romney is doing something similar, right? But like they're both kind of like wallowing in their own flaws, right? It's interesting, especially when you think of like some of the criticisms of the book where, they're saying things like, none of these characters are real or, rich in any way. I mean, I guess like to the extent that a novel in verse can't have the same richness of character as maybe a novel might, right? Because they just do different things. I guess you could sort of say that a little bit, but if you actually pay attention to what's going on, you see tons of like little things like this, like cropping up again and again throughout the text that do indicate a richness of character. So book 3, right? She's visited by Lady Waldemar. She hears about Marion after Aurora's asked to break them up, right? So that she could marry Romney. And out of curiosity, like, okay, who is this charity case that Romney wishes to marry? Let's see what this is about. So she decides to visit Marion and see what happens. And I'm not sure if it's book 3 or it's still in book 3 is when she actually like it's physically described where Marion lives. And I found this like very interesting, like around like line 790, 789. So as she's like visiting essentially her in this tenement, it's described as, I passed too quickly for distinguishing and pushed a little side door hanging on a hinge and plunged into the dark and groped and climbed the long, steep, narrow stair twixt broken rail and mildewed wall that let the plaster drop to startle me in the blackness. Still up, so high lived Romney's bride. It's almost as if like he's cloistering her away in this apartment that it's kind of like dingy and in keeping with like Marion's, I guess, like what maybe she's a little bit used to, right, being a charity case. and yet like it's very high up, right? And it's like this, it's an interesting metaphor for what Romney feels like in relation to other people, right? His charity, his philanthropy, his liberalism is meant to, or rather in his mind, right, it's meant to equalize him with others. But instead, you have all these clues. And this is like, it's just like a little bit of physical description, like where this woman lives. And yet there's this feeling of, there is no actual equality, right? There is this kind of idea where, he still wants to be apart from others, whether it's, she lives high up, or whether it's the fact that she's cloistered away, right? There's still, or the fact that, no way does Romney live in the kind of conditions that his wife to be lives in, right? That's like another interesting little element. Like what, like why of all places did she end up in this apartment? Like, it's weird.
Like for Lady Waldemar, I like that, like her verbal exchanges with Aurora. It's not like maybe in some ways it's sort of like catfight, right? There's this verbal sparring, but there's also this intense clash of personalities, because Lady Waldemar has this almost pathological view of love. And, for Aurora, love is this exemplar, and it's everything to her because of her father's words. And Lady Waldemar says, well, love's course, nature's course. Ah, there's the rub. We fair fine ladies who park out our lives from common sheep paths cannot help the crows from flying over. We're as natural still as blows a Linda. Drape us perfectly in Lyon's velvet. We are not for that lay figures. Look you, we have hearts within, warm, live, improvident, and decent hearts, as ready for distracted ends and acts as any distressed sempstress of them all that Romney groans and toils for. We catch love and other fevers in the vulgar way, and so there's this, and it ties into what my thoughts on Marion are. Like, there's this kind of purity complex that shows up in both Lady Waldemar and Aurora and Romney, where, Romney wants to, he's all for helping the poor, but he basically, like Rapunzel, he just stashes Marion up in this high tower. And some of Aurora's thoughts about Marion's child later on, that purity complex shows up again and is challenged.
Yes.
So, again, like with these like liberals who, or anyone really, not just liberals, not to be totally, what's the word? Anyway, like it could be anyone who professes this, like want to clean the filth, but are themselves like so disgusted by the filth. Whether that's the of the proletariat, the working class, or the poor, they just want to, cleanse they just want to cleanse it from their sight.
Do a Travis Bickle. In other words, that's like when wipe away, the rain will come. Yeah, that's kind of what's going on here. And, and it's interesting because then when we see later, when Aurora encounters Marion again and she sees that she has a child, and she immediately goes to judging her because it's still the Victorian kind of like pressure. And then she's like, comes to find out that no, this is what happened, that she was actually assaulted. And Aurora is immediately, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I'm such a jerk, blah, blah, blah. But
yeah, it's an interesting observation because like, Zeke mentioned that her father left her this idea that, love is supposed to be very high. It's supposed to be very important. But he also, Aurora says that he left me with two ideas, right? Two words, love and grief, right? So to her, it's not mere, there's this kind of conflation, right? They have to be, together, right?
Right.
You can't have, you can't necessarily have one without the other. And Rami doesn't, view it in that way. Others don't view it in that way, but she does seem to have a far more complex view of love, just like, Elizabeth Barrett Browning herself, right? When you read stuff like Sonnets from the Portuguese, a very complicated relationship with love. It's not merely, the same way that John Donne, right? When he writes about love and God, a complex relationship. It's not merely, what you would expect, right, from people in their respective stations to have these points of view, but it's all part of it.
Yes, and she says that's how I remember how she finishes it. I think I quote that in my review about God alone make heaven, and I wish I had the quote off the top of my head, but basically, art stems from love, and so it's a very romantic take
Yes.
on it. It's a very romantic. I mean, she's a very passionate, romantic person.
Yeah. So book 3 ends with Marion just starting to tell her story, and she continues this story in the 4th book, right? And it's kind of like, going back to exactly what the context of the meeting was, which as we mentioned, she was like one of these like charity cases. Romney saw her, and she starts to like, identify immediately, like, I hope Romney comes back and, sees me again. I want to be with him in some way. Similar, I guess, to like what happens though, with Jane Eyre, where, she sees Rochester as like the first man that's truly like really kind to her, and starts to like, fall in love with this like total weirdo in many ways. And Romney, Romney is like, being kind to her. And there's this, you get right away that, if you're a modern reader, maybe a little less than 1800s, but if you're a modern reader, and this is, one of those things where like when you have great art, it's not very easy to just like date it, right? It's not easily dated. If you're a modern reader, you know right away that just from a psychological perspective, this doesn't seem to be the best bedrock for a relationship, right? And it takes Marion some time to figure that out. Aurora sees it right away. And Waldemar sees it herself as well, but she sees it for selfish reasons, right? It's not like that she doesn't have a bedrock for love either, right? But she just wants what she wants, right? Whereas like, Aurora, it takes Marion some time to get to where Aurora is, right? Like Aurora is a more kind of self-actualized person, but the irony is Marion, self-actualizes ultimately before Aurora does, right? And and that's when Aurora is able to marry Romney after.
And Jess mentioned earlier how Marion is also sort of a fragment of Elizabeth's personality, because she has the same physical description. And speaking of dichotomies, like I guess one could read Aurora as the sort of the intellectual vigor of Elizabeth, and her passions and her need to become her own artist and her own name in the world. And Marion sort of represents that, because Elizabeth Barrett Browning was she was addicted to laudanum, which is an opium, what's the word, like offshoot or something. But she was basically, she was addicted to drugs and was an invalid
I didn't know that.
for much of her life. And so she would be bedridden and homestuck. And in much the same way that Marion is this sort of fragile, like I think like the very first physical description of her, she's like a vapor, and she's always this pale and insubstantial creature. And then at the very end, she just sort of fades away while Romney and Aurora gush over each other. And like even there's like in like Aurora's room in her childhood is like this fertile nest, like very natural and like with birds and nature all around. And Marion, when we first meet her, she's in this constrained urban environment. And so there's a lot of dichotomies here, which I feel like is kind of makes it less complex, the book entire, but we don't have to go there yet. But
well, Marion comes off, as I had written a note here, like she says, much fitter for his handmaid than his wife. She's so self-deprecating, and she's sort of a quintessential codependent. She just has no self-esteem. And as you were mentioning, she comes to actualize herself before Aurora after they've spent some time away. And then when Aurora sees her, she's like, no, this is what happened. I have this child because of this. I was assaulted. She seems to have come to know herself. And then Aurora's like, oh God, I'm a jerk. What did I do? And judging you. And I thought that was just really handled really well.
Yeah. And the self-actualization is like, because Marion is like all the characters, but it's explicitly stated that Aurora is sort of ventriloquizing for her, because her speech is very common and rustic. And so Aurora sort of, I guess, sophisticates it. But her self-actualization is in itself in the book sort of just built into Aurora's own through the language. And her own discoveries is caught up in Aurora's as the book progresses. So I thought that was cool. And I just came to that insight right now, so it's probably not worth it, but I don't know. It makes sense to me.
That's how they happen. They pop into your head.
Yeah. Aurora's comments on this kind of like so-called love, I found very interesting and also like very modern, right? You don't necessarily see this kind of stuff 150 years ago. So this is line 176. When she asks about like, well, does he love you? Her words reproved me. This perhaps was love, to have its hands too full of gifts to give, for putting out a hand to take a gift. To love so much, the perfect round of love includes in strict conclusion being loved. As Eden dew went up and fell again, enough for watering Eden. Obviously, she had not thought about his love at all. The cataracts of her soul had poured themselves and risen self-crowned in rainbow. Would she ask who crowned her? It sufficed that she was crowned, right? So this is what she sees in Marion, in the same way that, she's sort of coming to terms and has not fully resolved her own flaws, right? She's going to have to self-actualize. Marion will self-actualize as well. Zeke characterized it as like she just sort of like, fades away. I'm not so sure if Marion fades away. She probably does. And, it seems like she would go on to live a richer and more fulfilling life, right? Ultimately, simply because of, the strength of her character, by the end of the text, right? Which, you don't necessarily expect given how things begin, right? Here, right? When
and constant. Yeah, constant referencing to being women low to the ground. She wants to be Marion pleasures him to stoop for buttercups. I would not be a rose upon a wall. A queen might stop. Just real separate, self-deprecating talk. I'd rather be trodden by his foot than lie in a great queen's bosom. It's just like, really?
Yeah. Yeah, both Marion and Aurora like describe themselves as worms when it comes to the male figures in their life.
Yeah, worms and like I said, flowers on the ground. They're very pretty, and they're off onto the side, but they don't cause any trouble. But they're over there, and they're not going to harm you. But they're pretty, and it's a kind of interesting way to view that.
After all this happens, right? Marion tells the story. Romney goes to visit. So he enters the apartment and he sees Aurora for the first time. It seems in a while, and there's an interesting set of interactions, right, where she starts to sort of feel like, well, maybe. She's not so sure about, she's kind of like confused about her feelings, right, in relation to Romney after all this happens. And it's interesting because like, there's no real evidence that he has changed. Right. You start, you start to think like, well, what exactly has changed? Is Barrett Browning writing the following flaw into Aurora Leigh's character? Meaning the flaw that, hey, look, I didn't want this guy. He's an asshole. I made the objectively correct decision. But now, since he's about to be, married to this other woman, am I going to be like a little jealous? Am I suddenly going to, and that's like a stereotypical kind of like, I guess like historically it's a stereotypical like feminine thing, but it applies obviously to, men and women equally, right? There's this idea of if there's someone that's like, not giving you their love and it's kind of like, dangling it away, you start to sort of pine for it. That's kind of like a normal psychological reaction, right? And abusers sort of, understand that as well. It is interesting.
Carrot dangling.
Yeah, it is interesting that she has this longing now, right? For nothing has changed again, but why is this happening, right? And so their interaction, right? Like, she does not like when Romney tells her, well, Lady Waldemar is good. She doesn't correct him, right? She like Aurora knows right away that she's a manipulator. This is a bad person. And yet for whatever reason, she doesn't exactly say what she's up to. This is the way that she characterizes this. I found this like an interesting passage. What drew me back from telling Romney plainly the designs of Lady Waldemar as spoken out to me, Had I any right, I write, with womanly compassion and reserve, to break the fall of woman's impudence, to stand by calmly, knowing what I knew, and hear him call her good? Distrust that word. There is none good save God, said Jesus Christ. If he once in the first creation week called creatures good forever afterward, the devil only has done it, and his heirs, the knaves who win so, and the fools who lose. The word's grown dangerous. In the Middle Age, I think they called malignant fays and imps good people. A good neighbor, even in this, is fatal sometimes. Cuts your morning up to mincemeat of the very smallest talk, then helps to sugar her bohea at night with your reputation. I have known good wives as chaste or nearly so as Potiphar's, and good mothers who would use a child to better an intrigue. Good friends beside, very good, who hung succinctly round your neck and sucked your breath as cats are fabled to do by sleeping infants. And we all have known good critics who have stamped out poets' hopes, good statesmen who pulled ruin on the state, good patriots who for a theory risked the cause, good kings who disemboweled for a tax, good popes who brought all good to jeopardy, good Christians who sate still in easy chairs and damned the general world for standing up. Now, may the good God pardon all good men. Right. And this is like, you know, it's kind of like an attack a little bit on like the Romney liberalism, you could say, and like a bunch of other things. And also like, you know, she's bringing back the idea of art, right? Like this idea of like, you know, art critics and so on. All right. Like art is like, even when she's like talking about these other, you know, more worldly concerns, like art is never very far from what's going on, right? Either superficially or like internally in this book.
It was interesting. You made a good point when you brought up the devil. There's a great line in here, and I think I wrote it in my review, but the devil is something like the devilish. The devil is the most devilish when respected.
Yeah.
So that's when the devil can get you, is when it's coming from someone you respect, and that's very, very true. No, I just thought that I can't remember where that is in the book. I'm sure if I searched it, but yeah.
And with the Jesus Christ name drop, if I can, I guess, bring the religious aspect to it, or the spiritual might be a better word. Like throughout the book, there's again the dichotomy. There's the world of surfaces and appearances, and the material, and then there's the world that's beyond it, which is the actual real world. I guess it'd be tempting to say it's the Platonic ideal, but then later on, Aurora kind of reverses that. She says, no, it's not the ideal. It's actually the real. And the world of appearances is that which is illusory. And here, good is, you know, used ironically, I suppose, like, you know, Brutus is an honorable man, that sort of thing. Good in the sense of like social customs, the appearances. Oh, I'm polite to you and we do small talk, but then later I'll gossip about you. Or I'm good in public standing, but then I'll commit fraud or something like that. And here, you know, Lady Waldemar is good in that way. And I suppose Aurora, she doesn't really desire to break that illusion for Romney, but although she wants to. But and for Romney Aurora, it's where is it? I think, you know, it's funny how he's still so salty about what happened, about her rejection. What does he say? Yeah. He says, no, he sighed, within lines 321 down. No, he sighed with a sort of melancholy, impatient scorn, as some grown man who never had a child puts by some child who plays at being a man. You do not, cannot comprehend my choice, my ends, my motives, nor myself. No matter now, we'll let it pass, you say. I thank you for your generous cousinship, which helps us present. I accept for her your favorable thoughts. We are fallen on days, we two who are not poets, when to wed requires less mutual love than common love. For two together to bear out at once upon the love. As you know, he goes on and on about how you know, he's just so bitter about it. But then later on, like they have this long talk, and none of their dialogue is shown or written out. But you know, it's just Aurora internalizing the talk later on. And it's, you know, and they're vibing. I guess it's the common word now. And I don't know, like in the movie, like I'm picturing like a in the great Woody Allen film, it's like these two people who are, in a past relationship, they're talking, their romance is slowly rekindling, and those dialogue exchanges. I get that picture about how she's writing, how like there's this nice description of how there's two clocks set at the wrong time. They'll eventually merge, and it's that sort of exchange with them. Like or they were too close to be really when separated to be ever fully divided. Something like that. But I thought that was a nice subtle way to, so insofar as this is a love story, a lot of these, like what you said, Alex, about how Romney keeps popping up. Insofar as this is a love story, it's a very subtle way to, she's not pining over him. She has her own personhood, but it's a subtle way to express the growth of their love, in her mind. And so it doesn't come as a complete shock whenever they end.
Yeah, because we never really hear what his perspective so much,
right.
other than everything is told through her lens.
Yes.
So we don't know what he's internalizing, but at one point she's made references that, or at least early on, that he just doesn't seem to have a very rich interior life.
Sure.
He's kind of like, again, surface driven, image driven. I got to save the world because it'll make me look good and it'll redeem me, make me a good person. But I do think underneath all that, he really does want to be better. It's just, he doesn't, he's a buffoon. He doesn't really have a good way with words. He says all the wrong things.
Yeah.
So, it's kind of hard to be like, oh, yay, right. Romney.
I guess he gets his comeuppance later on, right?
Yeah.
in a very horrible way. But anyway.
Zeke, do you want to tackle book 5, since that's one of your favorites? And I agree with you that it's perhaps philosophically the richest of the books.
Well, it's really like I said earlier, and a lot of what these thoughts were informed by my own research on it, so it's not entirely original. But like how books 1 through 4 are very retrospective, and she's 27, she's writing everything about her childhood, and so there's nostalgia. But then book 5 and onwards, there's this. She's writing it later, but like I think in some books she's writing like I'm writing this down right now. There's this sort of immediacy, and that begins in book 5. And I think with the distance between character and narrator, when that recedes, at book 5, there's this sort of breaking the fourth wall moment, I feel, where it's not just Aurora speaking, but it's Elizabeth Barrett Browning. She's being she's being pretty obvious about what she wants to do with the book. About how, like what you said to that passage earlier, about how she distrusts poets who. I'll just read it out. I haven't marked.
Yeah, let's read it. It's like 155 or so. 155.
Okay, let me. Yes. Can I actually read a pretty long one?
Do whatever you want.
Okay, cool. This is 151 to like 198, something like that.
Okay.
All men are possible heroes, every age heroic in proportions, double-faced, looks backward and before, expects a morn, and claims an epos. But every age appears to souls who live in it, asked Carlyle, most unheroic. Ours, for instance, ours. The thinkers scout it, and the poets abound who scorn to touch it with a fingertip. A pewter age, mixed metal, silver-washed, an age of scum, spooned off the richer past, an age of patches for old gabardines, an age of mere transition, meaning naught, except that what succeeds must shame it quite, if God please. That's wrong thinking, to my mind, and wrong thoughts make poor poem. Every age, through being beheld too close, is ill discerned by those who have not lived past it. We'll suppose Mount Athos carved, as Persian Xerxes schemed, to some colossal statue of a man. The peasants gathering brushwood in his ear had guessed as little of any human form up there as would a flock of browsing goats. They'd have, in fact, to travel 10 miles off, or ere the giant image broke on them. Full human profile, nose and chin distinct, mouth muttering rhythms of silence up the sky, and fed at evening with the blood of suns. Grand torso, hand that flung perpetually the largesse of a silver river down to all the country pastures. 'Tis even thus with times we live in, evermore too great to be apprehended near. But poets should exert a double vision, should have eyes to see near things as comprehensively as if afar they took their point of sight, and distant things as intimately deep as if they touched them. Let us strive for this. I do distrust the poet who discerns no character or glory in his times, and trundles back his soul 500 years, past moat and drawbridge, into a castle court. Oh, not to sing of lizards or of toads alive in the ditch there. 'Twere excusable, but of some black chief, half knight, half sheep-lifter, some beauteous dame, half chattel and half queen, as dead as must be, for the greater part, the poems made on their chivalric bones. And that's no wonder, death inherits death. And, this is the era where, Tennyson was writing Idylls of the King, and there was this Victorian sort of nostalgic yearning for medieval romance. Mm-hmm. There was all this medieval literature that had resurged, and I think poets were disgusted with their age, which is discussed there. And they found that in these sort of fairy tales or myths, they could find a touch of the ineffable or the grand, the fantastic. Mm-hmm. But Aurora and Elizabeth Barrett Browning, she's making the claim that, the double thing, you're looking at appearances, and just because this current age seems grimy and too near to you, true poets should be able to see beyond the appearances and find the greatness and the glory.
Well, that goes to Whitman. Whitman
right. Which is Elizabeth Barrett published 1 year earlier.
Yeah. I mean, makes you wonder. I don't know if she read it or not, but it's where he found beauty in otherwise, this, in the mundane or in the grime of life, the grit and dirt. And it's I once had someone tell me they had this Whitman statue in Camden, New Jersey or something or other. And they said, oh, if only he knew that his statue's there, he'd hate Camden's such a crappy place, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, well, actually, he'd probably like it because that's represents kind of how he is. It's seeing the beauty in otherwise the grime and the dirt. Sure. And up until that point, poets had all been romantic and intellectual, and it was an astute profession. Yeah. And now, you had Whitman writing about, the guy, coal mining or the guy, fueling the blacksmith or whatever, everyday trade people, that there could be beauty and art found in everyday trade things. And she seems to recognize this.
Yes. And I want to add, this might not be exactly Aurora or Elizabeth Barrett Browning's point, but it's that ability of the artist to basically use their immediate surrounds and see story. Maybe an artist sees a rock and thinks it's a skull and writes a story about Joan of Arc, basically just not shying away from something that's near you because it doesn't have this exotic or fanciful air, and being able to utilize that for good stories. I don't know if maybe Aurora or Elizabeth Barrett Browning's being a little more high-minded than that, but I think that's interpretation exists and it's there. But yeah, I mean, so much of book 5 is basically her, it seems to me, justifying why she's writing this book. And for Aurora's character, just her, I guess, solidifying her sense of what artist she wants to be, and using sophisticated philosophizing to basically justify herself to whoever might be reading it. Maybe it's critics, maybe not. And it's, it's beautiful language. And I think there's a party later on too that happens, but it's mostly plot. But there are some interesting things that happen.
Yeah. Speaking of plot, I tried to be very systematic D-Day invasion type thing, and yet we forgot that in book 4 something critical happens.
Oh yes, right? That's right.
So Romney and Marion are supposed to get married, and Marion.
The letter.
Yeah, and Marion, doesn't show up to her own wedding, and she just, she writes this letter saying, "I can't marry you." Right? I don't think that this is actually love. Right. So she's starting this kind of self-actualization process. And interestingly enough, I found it funny how and also another kind of, speaking of Aurora Leigh's humor throughout, the crowd starts to turn on Romney, right? They start to blame him, right, for doing something bad. Did you violate the honor of this woman? What exactly happened? Which is funny because I mean, we already have as contemporary readers, we have a critique of liberalism. Browning has her critique of liberalism, and she's she's turning like Romney Leigh is essentially turned into this like villain by this crowd, despite the fact that we know that, his, let's say, intentions were good, but that's just, Browning's way of saying that, maybe his intentions were good, but we know that he's a deeply flawed person, and we're going to have him punished partly for these flaws in this way in particular. Right. And we're going to have like the instruments of his like creation, right? Whether it's Marion or the philanthropy that he does in general, we're going to allow those instruments to turn on him as a beginning, right? Ultimately, they turn on him even more deeply by the end of the book. But that's kind of like a taste of how volatile actually, what he's undertaking really is, like as a means to like, sort of be like a wake up call. Like, what exactly are you doing? Are you making the changes that you want to make, or what exactly, is happening else? So, and the reason I bring this up now is in book 5, near the end of it, there's this kind of like, a socialite party, and we have like, a bunch of people that show up, and Aurora Leigh hears a rumor that Romney might be marrying Lady Waldemar, right? Which really like affects her psychologically, and she, she gets upset, and then she asks herself, sorry, I don't have the line number here, but she asked herself, and after all now, why should I be pained that Romney Leigh, my cousin, should espouse this Lady Waldemar, and say she held her newly blossomed gladness in my face? 'Twas natural, surely, if not generous, considering how, when winter held her fast, I helped the frost with mine, and pained her more than she pains me. Pains me, but wherefore pained? 'Tis clear my cousin Romney wants a wife. So good. The man's need of the woman here is greater than the woman's of the man, and easier served. For where the man discerns a sex, the man can generalize, said he. We see but one ideally and really. Where we yearn to lose ourselves and melt like white pearls in another's wine, he seeks to double himself by what he loves, and make his drink more costly by our pearls. I mean, beautiful passage. I'm not sure if you guys have any like immediate responses to it, or what's she saying, or what.
I do want to say, like, with the idea of like he takes a wife just to add to himself and increase his own sense of himself. I'm going to talk about later about how I feel like there's a connection between the very opening and the very opening of the first book and the very ending of the last book. About how Romney, or at least a man, in the very opening passage, seems to instrumentalize this image of a woman for his own identity. And in this sense, Romney he wants a wife to increase himself and to fill up his sense of self. And a woman is simply exists to be dissolved in his wine to add to it. And later on, I think one of the endings later on is like Aurora compares herself to this block of salt being dissolved slowly. And so there's an interesting connection there. But yeah, I mean, I think that's all I have to say about it.
I think his motivations are, before he starts to really grow up a little bit, he's very selfishly motivated. He's just like, okay, I'm just really looking for an appendage. And it's quite obvious. Also, I just found that little quote that I mentioned about the devil. It's actually from the 7th book. It's the devil's most devilish when respectable. I thought that was really clever. And that's, I think, referring to Lady Waldemar, or anyone who has that image. That's really very, I mean, what an insight. I mean, that's an incredible insight. The book is just full of them.
And it's also kind of funny, right? I mean, I found that part humorous. Line 1075. For where the man discerns a sex, the man can generalize, said he. We see but one, ideally and really. Kind of like, as long as a guy could get, a body with a fucking vagina, that's good enough, right?
I know she has a couple other. There was a couple other funny things. Said, basically just like, well, you men, you just are, kind of simplistic.
For the humor. And just to talk a little bit about the wedding scene, like in book 5, she says, I don't want to write plays because they're too low or too base and they appeal to popular taste.
Yeah, I was going to connect that to like Dan's experiences writing plays. Like he said recently, like, I don't even want to send the shit around because, you know, with like, there's something about drama specifically that calls forth like the most narcissistic, you know, kind of like self-absorbed, you know, like niche kind of like, you know, we only produce plays that are based on, you know, gay men living in like some little fucking town, or like whatever, like really, you know, specific things. And this seems to be like, there's something about drama and acting, right, that calls forth like these kinds of, you know, personalities. And even in her time, she was able to identify that.
Yeah. And what I think is a little funny, maybe no one else will laugh at it, but in book 4, like the church and the wedding, like with this sort of sudden influx of like this new cast of characters and all this dialogue, it seems to be turned into a kind of play in itself with all these contrasting dialects and this grand drama, and all the people are surging to try to attack Romney. And so like she gets to do a little play writing in the book itself, while of course saying, oh, I don't want to write plays. And also like her descriptions of the lower class are pretty like gross, which just kind of speak to the purity complex about how, like, when she talks about these like mean, miserable people, they're like animals, like devoid of any joy. And because they've been sort of crushed, but it's like she can't afford to them any sort of personality apart from this, you know, meanness and coarseness, which is again challenged when Marion sort of really drops the gauntlet on her about her pregnancy. And, you know,
I mean, it's interesting because like, that part, you know, the wedding scene right before where you have like all these poor people that are like flooding the streets. And I think she uses words like slime.
Ramblings. Yes.
And, you know, I know that she was like criticized, especially, you know, by modern readers for using this kind of terminology. But I mean, when I was reading it, just struck me as, okay, so like, you know, Browning herself, you know, she has like poems like the Cry of the Children. I guess when she gets explicitly political, they're not necessarily her best poems, but she clearly has lots of political concerns. And that scene just felt to me like, okay, well, she knows what this kind of life is like, and she's just going to describe it from the perspective of, you know, everybody that's not part of this life. How would they view it? How would they feel? And not as a way to like demean the crowd, but just to kind of like relate, you know, this is what their existence is like, especially as perceived by anyone outside. And you know, you mentioned that, you know, we do have a Marion, right? Out of this crowd, you know, Aurora Leigh and also Browning herself, they pluck out Marion, who was given complexity, who was given self-actualization. So to the extent that, you know, she is a part of the slime, well, this is also a real human being and is more complex than even like Lady Waldemar, who, you know, is upper crust, right? But she does not have the complexity of a Marion. Does not have the self-actualization of a Marion.
Yeah.
So
that's right.
Yeah, very true. Very true. Well, I was thinking if we move on to, I mean, the 5th book is extremely rich. It's a lot of talk about art, and we could just go on and on just on that book. But what I thought was funny, and when she goes into the 6th book, I believe she spends a lot of time, she's in her head daydreaming.
Yeah.
But I love that she begins the 6th book. The English have a scornful, insular way of calling the French light. So she just, again, she's kind of taking some stabs at England, and then, but you know, she sees, I think, the French is more, you know, more her type, more romantic, I guess, more idealism. Idealism, very, very romantic, idealistic perspective. And from she says, and I'm so strong to love this noble France. So if I would call that, this is a lot of 6th book going into her musings. I walked on musing with myself on life and art, and it's more just, you know, internal dialogue.
So she's in France right now, right? So that's another interesting
on her
thing,
way to
right?
Italy, right?
Yeah. So like this thing that, you know, other writers would just use as kind of like throwaway observation about like France or whatever. She, you know, she's using it to move the plot, but also making it rich in and of itself. How will I, you know, tell the reader right now that and I'm in France. Well, a more kind of like basic 1800s, like, women's literature might sort of, prosaically give you that statement. But here we have a philosophical digression about France and English, and that, before we get to the plot point, why is she doing this? Why is this relevant? Oh, she's now walking through France before she, runs across and sees Marion with a child, right? And she gets suspicious, right? So, even as a plot device, right? There's a lot of richness there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And all the musing, I think, is sort of, there is philosophizing, but there's some kind of uncertainty there, which I think shows her sort of reflecting on her own prior positions and how she might grow. Like I walked on musing with myself in lines 203 on life and art and whether, after all, a larger metaphysics might not help our physics, a completer poetry, adjust our daily life and vulgar wants more fully than the special outside plans, philanthropies, material institutes. So, it's kind of in line with what you're saying, but there's still this sort of, she's still wondering whether or not it actually will help, especially after her, she's left London because, of the embarrassment of Romney and Marion's marriage, and she sold all her father's books. So there's this kind of emotional low point for her. She just wants to go home. She just wants to recapture this former childhood paradise. And so, preparing her for the end.
Yes.
And when she sees Marion finally, I thought it's pretty cinematic how it's portrayed, all the the suddenness of the lines and all that. But
yeah, I found that part interesting, partly because going back to this idea of Aurora Leigh is not like some perfect heroine.
Yeah.
So she sees who she thinks is Marion with a child, right? Ultimately, it does turn out to be Marion. But what jumped out to me was how quickly she just rushed to judgment about she must have stolen the child. When I read that, I've read this book before, but you lose like some of the plot details, and I was like, wow, what exactly is the reason for jumping to this? Not only is it like a very melodramatic, but she starts musing like, okay, how will I turn her into the police? Will the police believe me? She's already constructed this entire narrative of what Marion did, stole this child. She's already fantasizing about turning her in and what that would look like. How could she actually do that? Why exactly does she have this point of view? Is it because, she has maybe some of these kinds of negative feelings, from book 4 to the extent that she uses words like slime or whatever? Does she still view Marion as this kind of pitiful figure that no way could have a child in any way other than through theft, right? Because no way could someone love her, in a genuine way and marry her. Right. Is there something else going on? But, that struck me as when I'm reading critiques of the book or analyses, that people pass over that part, but I think it's very interesting in terms of just psychologically, and also in terms of building a character, building flaws, making sure that Aurora Leigh is not ever some perfect person, right?
And she's rushed to judge the way, she, in the beginning, she feels judged by people. So she's actually doing some of the same stuff that, people did to her. But that's normal. That makes her, she's not this perfect person. She's got flaws, but then she comes to realize, she admits her mistake. When she comes, Marion says, I was seduced. She doesn't use the word assaulted. I was seduced. And basically, and then she's like, oh, and she's very apologetic, and she becomes very protective of Marion.
Yes.
Yeah. And so in book 7 is when Marion recounts what happens with the rape. But before that happens, Jessica, in your review, you actually isolated the ending to book 6, and also in my notes, not my notes, but in my book, right? I dog-eared this passage because it's so beautiful, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So maybe you want to read that since you felt affection for it.
I can.
The end, basically the end of book 6.
I'll do the very end. I won't do the whole thing because my voice is probably crappy, but I'll just start with maybe line 1260.
Okay.
Yeah.
And ease my breath a little when none looked. I did not need such safeguards. Brutal men stopped short, Miss Leigh in insult. When they had seen my face, I must have had an awful look. And so I lived The weeks passed on. I lived. 'Twas living my old tramp life o'er again, but this time in a dream, and hunted round by some prodigious dream fear at my back, which ended yet, my brain cleared presently, and there I sat one evening by the road, I, Marian Eyre, myself alone, undone, facing a sunset low upon the flats, as it were, if it were the finish of all time, the great red stone upon my sculpture. How do you say that?
Sepulcher, I guess.
Sepulcher. Which angels were too weak to roll away. No, it's one of those things. I'm like, I didn't rehearse that word.
We shouldn't be asked how to pronounce words. Definitely not me. But that's fine. That's fine. It's perfectly fine.
No, and I think that's maybe this is a very poetic. It's melodramatic, but it's high melodrama. It's sad, and it's very beautifully said, and it's kind of her self-awareness right here.
Yeah.
Well, if I can say something, sorry, I don't know if you were finished.
No, go ahead.
You shouldn't ask permission. You should just do what you want to do.
Okay.
Always in the show and in life.
Fair enough. But yeah, I mean, like we were saying, how Marian self-actualizes and is one of the stronger characters. Like I was saying earlier about how the trope of the Redeemer keeps appearing, whether it's Romney, who is, thinks of himself as a Christ-like figure, but is actually sort of humbled out of that. Or if it's like Romney and Aurora's union together, which at the end sort of has this evangelistic, we'll heal the world with our combined powers and redeem the world and make it anew. But also like with that last description of Marian, of the stone of the angels being too weak to roll away, it's a reference to Christ and how angels like rolled the stone from his tomb. And it's sort of like an anti-resurrection moment where she reaches her very lowest point, and she's pretty, like she says, I was murdered, I was dead. But she is still cast in that role somewhat as the Redeemer who was slain. And she does kind of in the role, like as long as we're talking about religion, she is that sort of intercessor between Romney and Marian that ultimately, makes them unify because of her rejection of Romney. And so she takes on this Christ-like role of, purifying the relationship, but also going through this, horrible trial where, at the end, she's, she is Christ on the cross somewhat, or in the tomb.
Yeah. And I mean, it is very beautifully written. I underlined these lines in my text. Like, just imagine her kind of like looking out into this like eternity, right? Yeah. I, Marian Earl, myself alone, undone, facing a sunset low upon the flats, as if it were the finish of all time. Yeah. Right. Finish not only like in terms of like, ending, but finish also, you can imagine like, this idea of like the sunset, right? The veneer, the finish, right? What we think of like, paint or whatever, right? These like multiple meanings. So, I mean, like just beautiful, beautiful stuff.
It's pretty good for a girl whose name is a silly pun.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Marian Earl. Yeah.
Yeah. So in the seventh book is when Aurora Leigh is still suspicious, right? In book 6, seventh book is when Marian actually tells the details of, no, actually what happened to me was, I was raped, and this is why I have this child, and so after hearing, the details of the rape is, so Lady Waldemar basically like sends Marian off to, I forget exactly where she was sent off, but she was like essentially sent off to become a servant somewhere. Yeah, and
with a personal handmaiden. Yeah.
Yeah, and this maid like sells her, essentially into like sexual slavery. Yeah. And upon hearing this, Aurora Leigh is very upset, and she decides to write a letter to Lady Waldemar, like just basically, telling her exactly what she feels. Because, earlier on when she interacts with Lady Waldemar, it's clear that she doesn't like her, but they, it's this kind of like play on, if you read like, some like Victorian women's literature, it's this kind of, like chick lit sort of like, like this interplay of like, witty dialogue. But to me, like a lot of like that stuff. Yeah, a lot of that stuff isn't, a lot of like the typical women's literature, when it tries to do that, isn't really as witty as it thinks it is. But there's a lot of that wittiness still going. It's like that Victorian strain earlier on. But here, she wants to drop the Victorian strain. She wants to be direct, and I'm going to do it through this letter. Right.
Yeah. Well, and she thinks at this point, she thinks that Lady is married to Romney. She hasn't been in touch with Romney. So she's actually assuming that Lady Waldemar has married him.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so there's some of that underlining kind of like, she's like, look, bitch, fuck it. She doesn't like her. She doesn't like her. So I love it. She goes, and so I warn you, I'm Aurora Leigh. Yeah. And then at one point, I believe Lady Waldemar says, I don't remember the term, but I wrote it's somewhere where she insults the name Aurora Leigh. She says it's something like unsophisticated sounding. I can't remember what the term she used, but yeah, she has to attack her name as well.
Is that in the letter that she writes back in book 9?
Maybe.
It might be earlier. I don't know.
It's hard. It's like it starts to
guys, it's D-Day. We have to take this in steps, right? We're at the letter that she's writing to Lady Waldemar.
There's not a single exchange between them that isn't like really spiteful.
Yeah.
And
well, but also like book 7 is when Vincent Carrington, like one of their like mutual like painter friend, he's the first one to inform her to say that, hey, I read this manuscript of yours. It's actually good. Right. Yes. And his wife, I forget the name of his wife.
Kate, something. Yeah.
Yeah. Like she becomes like, she starts to idolize Aurora Leigh because of this book. Right. So we get like inklings of, perhaps, that's kind of like, again, it is interesting that we never get to read this manuscript. And yet we have people like Vincent and later on Romney Leigh telling her this is actually a good book, right? And you're left to wonder, how much of this is in fact true? Is she becoming the artist that she actually has always wanted to be? Is this simply more kind of, male posturing and not exactly like getting it? Like we don't have the answer to that question, which is, it's good, right? It's a pretty good tactic to take.
Yeah. He tells her, meantime, your book is eloquent as if you were not dumb, and comic critics ordinarily deaf to such fine meanings. Now, I think the word, if I'm not mistaken, I think the word dumb actually had a different meaning back then in Victorian England. Like it doesn't mean, okay.
You're not
mute.
talking.
They're not just meaning
like deaf and dumb. That phrase deaf and dumb, meaning deaf and mute. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I was mansplaining a little there. I'm sorry.
He says, fear not, friend. We think you have written a good book and you a woman. It's sort of like, again, he's complimentary, but it's a little half, half compliment there.
Yeah. That tension of the reader not truly knowing what exactly is the status, like objectively, like beyond like the, the lenses of whatever people might be saying about this book. I've always, enjoyed that kind of tension, just like, in Killing of a Chinese Book, at the very end, you don't know whether, Cosmo would tell you he's going to die or not. You don't know what's going to happen. That in between state is always, it always strikes me as very, very poetic. And it's a very good tactic that's used here.
Kate Ward. That's
Kate Ward. Yes, that's right.
Kate.
Yeah.
Found it. I knew I'd find it. Because, and then speaking of you mentioned one of you mentioned about dissolving. Was it salt or something? I found where at the end of chapter 7 or book 7, she says most like some passive broken lump of salt. There we go. Yeah. Dropped in by chance to a bowl of
whatever that is.
Whatever that is. Spoil the drink a little and lose itself, dissolving slowly until lost. I mean, that's a beautiful way of phrasing it right there.
Yeah. And after all this praise,
it's beautiful, especially because like, okay, she's getting, it seems like she's getting exactly what she's wanted, maybe she has ambivalent feelings about this book herself, so she's not ready to just accept it. And it's kind of like wearing this crown, right? But instead of being triumphant, it's something else entirely, right? It's a very unexpected way to end this kind of what ought to be a triumph, right? And this is exactly how to the extent, obviously like poetry is like poetic in the sense that, when you have like prosaic sort of writing, it's kind of, a one-to-one relation, you see what you get. Right. But, what poetry often does, like if you, for example, like read, Bruce Ario, right? Bruce doesn't necessarily use like the most poetic type of language. He doesn't necessarily use very flowery language, but structurally what you put next to one another, lines that go next to one another, it's by those kinds of unexpected devices, right? Same thing here, right? You have
and it's sort of like Vonnegut does that too. I mean, Vonnegut does not have flowery language, but it's how he assembles everything that makes something he's written incredibly poetic, like Slaughterhouse-Five, a very poetic novel. But it's like people on a shallow level look to someone more like Marquez, or people who are just, or Nabokov, people who are just outwardly, obviously florid. That's what they think poetic is. And it's like, well, no, not really.
Yeah. And this is also a book where she talks about like truth in art and what great art is, and the moral and the spiritual material dichotomy again. I'll jump around, like in line 744 to like 755. The book has some truth in it, I believe, and truth outlives pain as the soul does life. I know we talk our fade-ons to the end through all the dismal faces that we make, o'er wrinkled with dishonoring agony from any mortal drug. I have written truth, and I, a woman, feebly, partially, inaptly in presentation, Romney will add, because a woman. For the truth itself, that's neither man's nor woman's, but just God's. None else has reason to be proud of truth. And then later on, in line, I'm going to be doing a lot of lines, sorry. And line 761, she says, truth so far in my book, the truth which draws through all things upwards, that a twofold world must go to a perfect cosmos, natural things and spiritual. Who separates those two in art, in morals, or the social drift, tears up the bond of nature and brings death, paints futile pictures, writes unreal verse, leads vulgar days, deals ignorantly with men, is wrong, in short, at all points. We divide this apple of life and cut it through the pips. The perfect round which fitted Venus's hand has perished as utterly as if we ate both halves. Without the spiritual, observe, the natural is impossible. No form, no motion. Without sensuous spiritual is inappreciable. No beauty or power. And in this twofold sphere, the twofold man, and still the artist is intensely a man, holds firmly by the natural to reach the spiritual beyond it. And then later, in lines 854, she says, thus is art self-magnified in magnifying a truth which, fully recognized, would change the world and shift its modes.
Oh, yeah.
So I think, Alex, you wanted to discuss some of that.
So I was going to ask you, like earlier on when you were reading, that was kind of like the more spiritual side of art that she was discussing. I wanted to ask like about, what all of us think about the kind of moral dimension, right? So let me just read. It's going to be from 854 until 872. Thus is art self-magnified in magnifying a truth, which fully recognized, which changed the world and shifted its morals. If a man could feel, not one day in the art's ecstasy, but every day, feast, fast, or working day, the spiritual significance burned through the hieroglyphic of material shows. Henceforward, he would paint the globe with wings and reverence fish and fowl, the bull, the tree, and even his very body as a man, which now he counts so vile that all the towns make offal of their daughters for its use on summer nights when God is sad in heaven. To think what goes on in his recreant world, he made quite other. While that moon he made to shine there at the first love's covenant shines still, convictive as a marriage ring before adulterous eyes. So like first, to the brief, pagan versus Christian stuff. A lot of what she says here is much more reminiscent of what you would find in, Roman and Greek writing, right? They're not there to sort of, attack the body or find something vile or disgusting within it, right? This is what Nietzsche would discuss. And she's also arguing for the same thing, right? You should not, right, view your own body as vile, but she's discussing this like moral dimension, right? And there's a couple ways to view it, right? In the most kind of like superficial sense, we have, Shelley, right? He wrote A Defense of Poetry. I remember reading that essay when I was a teenager and thinking, this is exactly what art shouldn't be, right? It's not mere morality in the way that he's trying to reduce it to. And today, right, we have like obviously, artists that are so caught up in their own politics that they think that they're somehow equivalent, right?
Or the artist makes a good person.
Yes. Yeah, or the artist makes a good person, right? But as I've grown older, I start to think of this more in kind of like Nietzsche in terms of ethics, not like can great art sort of improve the world? And I think the answer is yes, right? There is a kind of betterment. You could feel this like every single day in kind of like your more everyday life. Like when I'm walking down the street, I could listen to some kind of like, funny podcast and sort of like diddle away my time, or I could listen to an audiobook, right? And I feel differently when I make one choice versus the other. If I'm reading a book and I get through, I don't know, like a great novel or whatever, I feel like I've sort of altered myself. Whereas, making any other choice, you feel like, maybe you didn't waste your time, but you didn't use your time as well as you can. So in that way, right, there's this kind of ethical dimension. But I view, to the extent that art has a relationship with ethics, I view it in terms of, the Nietzschean sense of like greater than, like, can you become better in some way? Can you, like, is the sum of art greater than the sum of something else? I think the answer is yes, right? And is this better for people by, all kinds of objective metrics? The answer is yes. So I don't know if someone else wants to like tackle this part.
The idea though that that art, there's more to art than just being ornamental or just being entertainment. And it's not just a form of escapism. I mean, one of the lines, and I'm sending you this review next month, was in Bright Star, the film on John Keats, was that one of the actors mentions, the character says that when you see poets staring off into space, they're working. They're actually, it's not just a form of escapism. Whereas like, you see anyone else. I remember like when I was young and I would have this habit, 20 years plus years ago, that people told me I stared off into space a lot. They were like, oh, you're spaced out, not realizing that I'm actually was thinking. And it is kind of unfortunate because like we creative types, I never had anyone tell me that, like another artist never told me that I did it. It was always somebody with the quote unquote, simple thoughts or whatever. And so I think then like going back to say, like when I sit down to watch a film on like say Criterion Channel, I'm not looking at this as like, okay, I'm just going to watch this film and fritter 2 hours away. And, it's not like binge watching a Netflix show. You come away from it and you're like, oh, I feel like I watched something interesting. Or if it's not even very good, you say, well, at least I've now educated myself and I know that this film isn't very good and I have an opinion on it. So there's something always to take from it. And I think, that's sort of what she is recognizing there.
Right.
And anyway, you have something.
Like I've spoken with many, like from my tradition, many Christians who are interested in art, and maybe they're not artists, but they enjoy and have a passion for it regardless. And when I talk to them about like, what do you feel like is great art, or what do you feel is worthwhile art? A lot of them will say that it's art that points to God, or it reflects God's glory, or something in that language. And like you said earlier about art not being just mere entertainment, I think Aurora, and I have problems with how there is a kind of, I've said this before, there's a kind of like evangelistic, programmatic urge in the book that I'm not sure about, but like she sees artists as, I think I don't know the lines, I don't know the passage, but I remember the word. She describes artists as almost like demigods who need to
Yes.
be
Yeah, I remember
almost
that.
like representative of the mean,
Yes.
low masses who can't articulate the deeper things or the higher things. And poets take on that role, sort of like a Christ-like figure. I mean, she talks a lot about how they suffer and toil, and they suffer for them for this effort to kind of plunge into the essence, the what lies beyond the veil, the illusion of the mere appearances. And I think in terms of just like artistic success and the art's ability to, she says, change the world and shift morals. Like I think Elizabeth Barrett Browning or Aurora would like to hear that, like for say, like when Ingmar Bergman made Scenes from a Marriage, like divorces in Sweden like went up, right? And it's just the art's power to like shift culture in a way and change how people think about themselves. And I'm sure these people were like, oh, I'm not, this movie made me realize how unhappy my marriage was. Maybe, I don't know. And I think Aurora or Elizabeth Barrett Browning would like that art's power to sort of, to have a person come to a deeper realization about themselves or the world. And for ethics, I don't know, I've struggled with this. Like I've heard Dan say, or other people, like art has there's no ethical side to it, or there's a danger in it, which is true. But I also feel like you want to put great out in the world because in some sense that it's good for people, even if or someone who is open to it. Maybe it's just a thing in the world like any other sort of cosmic material, but it's still, at least to other people, it's someone who's open to it, can communicates to them in a refined way, the greatest art at least, something that it matters, is significant, has some kind of a deeper relevance to someone's life journey. I don't know. And like in this book, and like I think she says in a letter somewhere, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the point of the verse novel was aspiring to life, like to put life and all its like complexity and messiness, cram it into this sort of like awkward mishmash of genre. And she succeeds in that. And apart from my own doubts about whether or not art, like, and later on in like book 9, Romney remarks art's a service. Like it's something you do for other people. It's one thing you do, and it can be all sorts of things. It can be just a distraction. It can be something you do for yourself. It could be a narcissistic thing. But yeah, I resonate with that personally because I do consider myself more of an idealistic person. But my more cynical side says, well, this feels somewhat restraining as well. But it's all beautifully phrased, but you don't find any writers really saying that without a kind of like embarrassed air nowadays. I feel it's all about, well, I remember I have a friend, or I'm aware of some people who like, if you, I remember I wrote something about angels or something in one of my poems, and the remark was that, why write about angels or the things of beauty when there's so much suffering in the world?
This is the way
your
that
art
it would
to be
be
political, that sort of thing. I don't know.
This is the way that it would be restricted, right? It's not like I actually agree. Like I agree with the statement that art is a service, but where it gets restricted is when people start saying, well, therefore, you can only in 2021, the only books you could write are books about climate change or about the perils of the working class, right? That's when it gets restrictive. But in a broader sense, like clearly great art is a service, because why am I annoyed with people that I know that admit that they're mediocre writers and critics and yet still continue to put trash out into the world? Because they're in it for one reason only, and that is self-absorption. They want their name out. They want people to clap for them. Whereas if you're actually doing something of value, that is, if you're making great art, that is by definition a service. There's no way around that. But people, people try to put additional restrictions upon that are, unnecessary, right? But it's in its basic sense. I do agree that there is this kind of, a service to it, and something earlier that Jessica said about, artists, sitting around and, looking out into space. I'm sure, we all do this. And the reason why I never ask people about this, like if I see someone staring into space, I'm never like, oh, what are you thinking about? Because that's
when you do this, when they do this, oh, I hate when they go,
oh my God, it's
hate
so, and it's like, whether it's a hand or whether it's like a comment, it's so fucking intrusive because
yes,
shouldn't you have times in your life when you're doing exactly that? When you're just kind of like, sitting back, but of course also, for men, it's also a little bit different because one thing that I have noticed, especially for me and like all men that I know, men also they love alone time because they love to sit and brood and scheme. We love to brood and fucking scheme. I love that. Even if you don't really plan on doing anything with some of your plans, just to sit back and scheme, it's so wonderful.
Yeah.
So it's not just the creativity. There's also a lot of like stuff that comes out.
Yeah, but I never, like I said, I never had a fellow writer or artist ever criticize me for doing that because they do it too. Sure. So we're all staring off into space because we're thinking, but I hated that. Hello, it's like, go away. You're it's very intrusive. It's very patronizing and make it like you're spaced out, like you're an airhead. And this could be a whole other show about how creative people really have a hard time in the world because of, we live in the world of like, functional stuff and you have to be practical minded. But if you're off in your daydreams like Aurora Leigh, the world isn't very sympathetic towards it.
Yeah. Lord Howe tells her to compromise. Lord Howe's like, oh, you need to compromise. Like, you can't go chasing Apollo and the naiads and the dryads or whatever. Like, you have to be like other women who sort of sacrifice those things for marital
and it's like this whole book. I feel like this whole poem is it can be on one hand like a manifesto of art. It can be a manifesto of selfhood, and to just limit it to feminism is just kind of making it simplifying it. And I said in my review that some ways it comes off non-feminist. She does end up with the guy. I mean, but it's like that shouldn't be the deciding factor. It's like, even if she had put forth ideas that didn't, mesh with today's culture, that doesn't diminish the quality. It doesn't diminish the craft. Yeah. And that's the thing that people need to examine. And like, I never had to read this in school. It was not required reading. And it is a shame, but I do think that this is very readable when people know basically what they're getting into. If you have an idea of the story, you're going to be fine. Yeah. It's really not as intimidating as you might think, because I read it once.
There's nothing shameful about that either. I mean, look, I look up the plot before reading books like this. I'll look up the plot before reading Shakespeare play. It's fine. Who cares?
Yeah. Constantly refer to the notes and all that. Yeah.
Right. Because it gives you more, you can dive deeper and you can see more into it. So
and it's an epic. It's a really great epic. It's more of like an interior epic. I think I called somewhere in my show notes, like, it's more of an epic of the mind. Because like we were talking about earlier, if you think about it, a lot of the book is Aurora just doing what you guys were saying earlier, just sort of sitting and writing and thinking about her life.
Yeah.
And there is sort of continent spanning journeys, and there's a kind of epic geographical scope. But with the sheer range of what she goes through as a person, and her, and just being open about her blind spots and her expansive views on art and life. I mean, it's longer than Paradise Lost, and it's about as complex, if not more so.
Well, I had made the argument, and I don't know how you guys feel about it. Like I said, you could argue that I said, this is a great work. It's not necessarily a perfect work. Like you could argue that maybe there's some parts that are that go on a little long. But I don't know really what amount, how much that would be, or what would require. I mean, could some parts have been trimmed a little? I mean, because I feel like so much of the book is very early on, and then we get book 6, and then we find out about Marion in 7, and then the end is sort of like, and we got Romney there, and it's like, okay, now I realize, like, by the ninth book is really just kind of, saying, okay, now she realizes her love for him, and this side, that, or the other.
In book 8, there's an interesting kind of like by book 8, Marion and Aurora are living, I believe, in Italy with the child. They're taking care of it. And Aurora has this like hallucination, it seems. And like this, like shortly before like line 60, methinks I have plunged, I see it also clear, and oh my heart, the sea king. In my ears, the sound of waters. There he stood, my king. I felt him I felt him rather than beheld him. Up I rose as if he were my king indeed, and then sat down in trouble at myself and struggling for my woman's empery. 'Tis pitiful, but women are so made. We'll die for you, perhaps. 'Tis probable, but we'll not spare you an inch of our full height. We'll have our whole just stature, 5 feet 4, though laid out in our coffins. Pitiful. You, Romney, Lady Waldemar is here, right? So that was like, essentially addressing and thinking about Romney, which is odd. We don't have yet a marriage, right? We don't have any indication they're going to get married, and yet still there's this kind of like premonition. But even in this premonition, even if we have this kind of like stereotypical, like, oh, I'm a woman and this is going to be my king, she does say that I'm not going to spare you the totality of who I am, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe I will treat you as a king, but I will demand a lot from you, right? In terms of respect and so on and so forth. So book 8, they start talking to one another, and it's like this like odd, it's like this like comedy, it's like this comedy of manners, especially, right? A little bit similar to what's going on earlier in the book, where she believes that he's marrying Lady Waldemar, and he's speaking kind of like, in circles. She thinks that he's speaking in circles around her because he's not dealing with the most obvious thing, which is, hey, you're about to marry this like sick fucking woman, and we need to come to terms with this fact, right? When by the end of it, he's like, no, I'm not marrying her, and in fact, this is a letter that she wrote to you. In book 9 is when she reads Lady Waldemar's letter, right? And after realizing that, okay, they're not going to get married, this opens up, right, room. And book 9 is the shortest book. It's about 900 lines or so. It opens up some room. And it seems like, it's kind of interesting, right? Pretty much all the books are around 1,200 lines. This is, about 25% shorter than the rest. It makes sense that this would be the one that's a little bit shorter, right? You get to this, like, you get to this marriage, and yet by making book 9 the shortest, the marriage is not really the point of the book. Whereas, like, if you read like something like, Emma by Jane Austen, yes, like Emma is a flawed character like Aurora Leigh, but the flaws of Emma do not rise further than she's a fucking gossip, right? And she needs to learn to be like not a gossip. Here, Romney and Aurora have to change in very different ways, and yet in ways that would allow them to come together, right? But the point ultimately is not the marriage. The point is the changes. So, even just like the length, right? It makes sense. I don't know to what extent this was conscious on Browning's part, but, it is an interesting little thing to think about.
And their union itself isn't like it. And I think I cut out a bit too early on.
That's fine. It's fine.
Like you were saying, I may have missed something. So if I'm repeating anything, I apologize. But like their union, like I guess in those other books, like them getting together would be like the whole, like you said, the whole point of it. Like, oh, they're married now, they can live a happy life. But there is like their union is building towards something greater than themselves. Mm-hmm. And again, in biblical language, it's like, their union in itself, their combined powers will establish this, again, like this changed world with the changed economy, changed government. Basically the image out of Revelations, where the earth will be renewed by the coming of heaven, or something like that. Mm-hmm. And also the very, did we talk about his blindness yet, or?
Yeah, not yet. So, I mean, okay. So Aurora Leigh reads the letter from Lady Waldemar, right? Waldemar, it tries to explain herself. You, Zeke, you mentioned in your article that, Waldemar is not given the full kind of evil, right? Yeah. The full caricature of, hey, she had this scheme to sell Marion into sexual slavery because she was jealous of her. She actually didn't know about that part, right? She wasn't, it seems like she did just want her to just, okay, go away here, take this job and whatever, leave me alone. So that's kind of like what she explains. But beyond that explanation, more or less Waldemar is kind of like who we take her to be, right? And after that opens up. So after she reads this, she's like, okay, so they're not getting married. And Aurora essentially proposes to, right? That's the other thing, right? Aurora is the one that's now the romantic aggressor, right?
Yes.
She's the one, no, you don't get it. I want to marry you now. And he's the one like, no, this is like,
that's a good point.
This is bullshit, right? She becomes the romantic aggressor at the end.
Yes.
So you wanted to mention the blindness, Zeke? Like, what do you want to say about
that? This might be a little too like English lit analysis, but I just found it interesting that, in the very opening, you see the very opening stanza is Aurora describing this image of this male friend taking out the image of a friend that he has ceased to love and looking at it and instrumentalizing it for his own self-conception, using his sight, looking at it. At the very end, where Romney is basically humbled and his Christ-like overture has failed because he turned Leigh Hall into an almshouse, and basically the public turned on him, burned the home down, and like a fallen spar struck his head, and now he's blind. And at the very end, tied into what you said about Aurora being the romantic aggressor, now like he can't even see, so he can't even instrumentalize her sight, the sight of her or his image of her for his own. Concept. It's Aurora now who basically is in the powerful position, and the very ending lines is her describing and beautiful, I think, like with biblical gems, describing foundations which their union will lay for the future. And he's blind, and now he must rely on her. And throughout the movie, throughout the work, like Romney has sort of like, I guess, impacted her and built her sense of who she is, and now I guess now he must rely on her to get through the world, and he is the weak one. And I guess that fully sort of that kind of still ties him into the Christ metaphor, but yeah. Anyway, that's what I found interesting about it.
Yeah, she does. She says, "If now you'd stoop so low to take my love."
Yeah. So there's still that.
One thing I wanted to ask you guys about this. So this like Romney goes blind, right? So George Eliot, she had a positive review of Aurora Leigh after it came out, but she did have a negative remark about the fact that she was like, and it's unfortunate that Miss Browning decides to do the kind of Victorian fashion of kind of like giving one of her heroes some sort of like physical deformity. In this case, it's blindness. And like so what do you guys like think about that? I think there is like a little bit something to the critique, because in general, the way that blindness is used in fiction, like historically, it tends to be like a little obvious, right? So like I think maybe the first kind of like a famous example that I can think of at least is in Homer when Odysseus fights the Cyclops, right? The Cyclops is one-eyed, and the reason why he's one-eyed, it seems to be the implication that these Cyclopes, they live outside of society, right? They don't even like there's more than one Cyclops, right? But they don't live together, right? They don't live in like sort of like socialized colonies. They're all apart from one another. And the Cyclops, by having one eye, that shows that if you are a person that wishes to be so apart from society, not contribute, not not do anything worthwhile, and be kind of like I guess like immature in terms of your socialization, you end up like this monstrosity, the Cyclops. And then you have like examples where like more recently you have inversions of this trope. So I remember like reading a negative review of Woody Allen's Crimes and Misdemeanors, and one of the negative comments was, isn't it just like so silly how like one of the eye doctors there, I forget if he's like a brother or a cousin to someone, but so like the Martin Landau's character who pays for the assassination, who pays for the assassination of his mistress. He has like, I think it's his relative or something, who he's also an eye doctor, but he's blind. And
Right.
this like religious Jewish eye doctor, he's telling Martin Landau or all these things like, like all this religious stuff, like,
Well, Ben. It's
yeah,
Ben is a rabbi.
Ben.
Ben's
Yeah,
a
Ben the rabbi.
rabbi.
Yeah.
And he's losing his eyesight, and
Yeah.
he has the insight. And Ben is he is the brother to Alan Alda. Alan, right? Alan Alda.
Is it?
And
Is it?
I don't know if he's
maybe.
the brother,
Yes.
but yeah, he's
Yeah.
in there.
Yeah. I don't
Because-
remember. Yeah, I don't remember the relationships, but the
Right.
point I was
Yes. Oh no, remember the relationship, because Woody Allen is married to his wife, who's
Yeah.
bitchy, and that's her two brothers, Ben and
Okay.
Alan
Okay,
Alda. Remember,
gotcha.
he's jealous of Alan Alda, but he likes Ben. He goes, well,
Yeah.
because Ben's no threat to you. Okay,
Yeah.
that I had to think of it. Yeah.
But so this reviewer, he had something negative to say about the movie, because to him it was like, oh, it's so obvious that Ben is going blind, and yet, oh, look, he's the one that sees, all the things that are right. But in fact, it's the opposite. Ben is going blind, and superficially you think, oh, look, Ben has
Yeah.
all these like positive insights about, human psychology and really how the world works. But in fact, he doesn't. Martin Landau, who's like, oh, I feel so guilty. Eventually, he loses all that guilt and his life is normal. Ben ultimately is wrong. That trope of blindness leading to wisdom is inverted. Here, blindness does lead to wisdom. And I think George Eliot she doesn't make, her point is kind of like, it's more superficial. It's like, oh, why did you do this thing where you marred, a hero? To me, it's the specific kind of marring that feels like kind of like, it's like a, it's a little bit trite, but
Sure.
the thing that saves it is it's handled well in terms of like just writing itself. So, at the end of
If I recall, in Jane Eyre, is Jane Eyre Rochester? Does he go blind?
Rochester goes blind. That's also one of her critiques. Like, that's like one of the things that she points out. Like, oh, look, this happens like in Victorian literature all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But here, like, it's so well written, so it seems like it doesn't matter all that much. So this is how the book ends. My Romney, lifting up my hand in his, as wheeled by seeing spirits toward the east, he turned instinctively where, faint and far, along the tingling desert of the sky, beyond the circle of the conscious hills, were laid in jasper stone as clear as glass the first foundations of that new near day, which should be builded out of heaven to God. He stood a moment with erected brows in silence, as a creature might who gazed, stood calm, and fed his blind, majestic eyes upon the thought of perfect noon. And when I saw his soul saw, jasper first, I said, and second sapphire, third chalcedony, the rest in order, last an amethyst. So, I mean, it's handled really beautifully.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
You have this like biblical city, these like biblical jewels being sort of, erected, and he cannot see it. Right. It's kind of like Moses, and also, like, it's also like, MLK quoting Moses, I may not get there with you. Right. And she's seeing for him. Right.
Yeah.
And it goes back to the whole idea that the plot of the story, it's nothing that's so, convoluted or complex. It's what goes on the inside.
Yeah.
And so it's a very
Yeah.
internal book, and it's, and it's like something can be great and not perfect and fall to some, convention of this or that. But in the end, you're just sort of like, how is it done? And she does it very well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
At the very least, it all fits, right? Because losing his sight is like trapped in the world of appearances. When he loses his sight, he's finally able to get beyond and finally, assess the world, the truer world, I guess you would say. And it's with the work of the poet. Although I do wonder, I don't know if this is a slight divergence, but I did hear I did see like some critiques of the work. Like at the very end, there's this sort of, or just throughout the book, there's this tension between, like I said before, Aurora being an artist and Aurora being a woman. And tied into her being a woman is finding love. At least that's how it's set up in the book. And being tied up into being an artist is that solitary life where she's able to achieve her work. That's, by all reports, like really good. inspires Vincent Carrington and Romney. And then there's the critique that says, well, it becomes very unlikely that Aurora is able to fulfill her art going forward because she has now subordinated art to love. And she makes that explicit. Like, you know, art's much, but love is more. Right?
Oh, so, it was the quote. I have that. All art in heaven, art in. So anyway, let's see if I can find
something
it.
along those lines. And so like she, and some critics say she like, it's not exactly like a full characterization because she has to like sacrifice being an artist so she can be a woman and find love. But if she wants to be an artist, she can't fall in love. And, you know, that's not entirely realistic. Well, but
here it is. Oh, art, my art, thou much, but love is more. Art symbolizes heaven, but love is God and makes heaven. Now, I use that quote actually in my Red Shoes review, because that's a film, if you watch the Red Shoes, about this woman who wants to, you know, work, live for her art, but then she can't be married. She can't be married to, because, you know, as it explains, she's powerless when she has these red shoes on. And so, it's basically that kind of same trope being reused there. Yeah, but the idea that art is this, but love is so much more. And you know, I mean, again, idealism, it's a romantic notion. Yeah. She's a romantic, and that's how she feels about it. I mean that. Right. So I can believe she'd say that.
Yeah. Maybe I was a little too harsh about the whole blindness thing. I mean, like, if you think about it, like, okay, to what extent is it being inverted? Well, first of all, like, he can only see now. It's not that he innately suddenly has all this, like, you know, overflow of wisdom. It's with her assistance, right? She points out and says, these are the jewels. This is what's happening. But also, to the extent that he does cultivate wisdom, right? He turns his face, she says, instinctively, right? There's this, so I mean, there is also even some like inversion going on here that George Eliot probably didn't see as part of the review.
I probably have to rethink my connection with the opening stanza, but anyway, go on.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I feel like we were going to maybe talk about some reviews, but honestly, I feel like we kind of covered it all. Yeah. If you guys have anything else to say or not.
No Virginia Woolf takedown?
I mean, we kind of covered that. I mean, you know, I mean, we could one day do a show just trashing that kind of stuff, because it's like,
maybe we should do a Virginia Woolf show just trashing her, because I feel like a lot of the stuff that we do is like very positive on ArtiFact, but could do some trash talk as well.
Sure.
But then you gotta read her stuff, and it's just with her, it's like her dialogue and her character development, and she's so melodramatic, and she uses a lot of like cliches, but then everyone always praises her, and I mean, it's just like a headache.
So I mean, Jessica mentions Virginia Woolf and discusses that review right in her article on this book. And one thing I'll say is, like, when I was younger and I first read Ulysses, right, I was thinking, you know what, like, this book might be good, but it's probably not as good as people say. Let me find some negative reviews and see what the critiques are. And of course, like, I came across, like, you know, Virginia Woolf's famous statement on Ulysses, like something like, Ulysses is like the book of a man who decides that, you know, his house is feeling a bit stuffy, so he decides to break all the windows. And I was like, okay, that seems like an apt description of some of the excesses of Ulysses. But then I read To the Lighthouse and I was like, what the fuck? Like, this, she's just doing doing exactly what James Joyce does, except not as well. Right. And she clearly, like, she was just jealous of what he did and his fame or whatever, not even jealous of like the talent or whatever, but just jealous, like, oh, why can't I be talked about in the same tones as this guy? Let me try to do something similar. And, you know, it's a worse book than Ulysses. I'm not saying Ulysses is great, but, you know, To the Lighthouse is even worse. And, you know,
you'll like the review I'm sending you of the Dead. I'll be sending you that one next month.
Yeah, I reread that story a few months ago. Well, thank you guys. This was a truly a great show. This is one of the
really fun,
this is like the only show of its type, on Aurora Leigh. So this is different, right? People are not having this. So thank you guys for watching. If you've been watching this on YouTube, please hit like and subscribe. If you would prefer to watch this or rather listen to it an audio podcast, we are on Spotify, we are on Stitcher, we are on Apple Podcasts, anywhere that you get your podcasts. This podcast is available. So whatever that you guys do, we have you covered. Again, thank you for watching, and we'll see you next month.
Oh my God.